A wet kitchen towel has no business anywhere near a grill, and yet that is exactly what kept the ribs from drying out at every backyard cookout from Memphis to Mobile. One trick out of 100, and every last one passed down the same way, standing next to somebody who never opened a cookbook. Number 71 on this list uses apple cider vinegar in a way that changes the bark on a brisket entirely. Number 34 turns yesterday's coffee into a dry rub no store bottle can touch. And number 12 involves the one part of the chicken most people throw away before it ever reaches the grate. 100 BBQ tricks. Black grandmothers kept behind the screen door for decades. Hit subscribe because this list runs deep. Number 19, screaming the skillet hot before the batter goes in. This is the one trick that separated their cornbread from everyone else's, and it started with patience. The greased iron pan went into the oven empty or sat over the open flame until it was almost smoking. Cooks listened for it, and they watched it, looking for the first thin wisp of smoke off the grease. When a drop of batter hit that surface and hissed like water on a stove lid, the pan was ready, and not 1 second before. Only then did the rest of the batter go in, and the whole bowl would crackle and spit the moment it touched the metal. That violent first contact set the crust instantly before the inside ever began to cook. The bottom seared and sealed itself in the time it took to set the bowl down. The result was an edge so crisp it cracked like glass when you cut it, golden brown all the way around, while the middle stayed tender and steamed soft. A cold pan gave you pale, greasy bread that stuck and stewed in its own moisture instead of searing. The hot pan gave you that lacquered bottom every Sunday plate fought over, the peace children begged for. It took no extra money, only the patience to wait out the heat. Heat the iron until it scares you, then pour. Number 24, pot liquor preservation. When your grandmother boiled collard greens with a ham hock for 3 hours, the liquid left behind was not waste. It was medicine in a mason jar. She saved that greenish broth, rich as liquid gold, poured it into jars, and kept it on the back porch in winter or the root cellar in summer. Families drank it straight or sopped it with cornbread. Extension agents told black families to throw the cooking water away because boiling destroyed the vitamins. They were half right and completely wrong. Researchers in Spain found that boiling extracted 50% of total flavonoids and 60% of vitamin C into the cooking liquid. The vitamins were not destroyed. They migrated into the pot liquor like passengers changing trains. The women who saved that broth were capturing every nutrient the greens had to give. They did not need a study to know it kept their children strong through winter. Number 25, reading the foam on a pot of beans. Big Mama did not set a timer for pintos. She watched the foam. When a pot of dry beans first comes up to a boil, a thick gray crown rises to the top. Younger cooks today skim it off and worry. The older women in the kitchen knew what it meant. That foam is starch and saponin lifting out of the bean skins, and the way it behaves tells you the temperature of the pot. A loose, drifting foam means the beans are simmering right. A tight, packed foam climbing the side of the pot means the heat is too high and the skins will split before the centers turn creamy. Big Mama would lift the lid, look once, and slide the pot half off the burner without saying a word. By the time supper was on the table, every bean was tender to the tooth and not a single one had burst. The foam was the timer. Her eyes were the thermometer. Number 24, measuring salt in the cup of the palm. There were no spoons in her hand when the salt box came down off the shelf. Big Mama poured the salt into the soft hollow of her left palm, the one nearest the thumb, and gave it a half shake to settle the grains. A flat puddle was for greens. A small mound was for the bean pot. A heap that crowned over the edge of her hand was for a fresh batch of cornbread batter. She had learned the measure standing next to her own grandmother as a child, and her hand knew the right weight the way a piano player's fingers know a chord. Food scientists today have measured the average cooking palm at right around 3/4 of a teaspoon. Big Mama had figured that out without ever opening a book. She's salted by feel because feel never lied to her, and the cardboard box of Morton sat right there on the counter where her hand could find it in the dark. Number 24, saving every last drop of bacon grease. Nothing left that stove without giving something back. Bacon grease went into a tin can or a mason jar and sat by the burner until it was needed. It replaced butter. It replaced store-bought lard. It seasoned cast iron. It flavored collard greens, cornbread batter, fried eggs, and reheated rice. One strip of bacon could season 3 days of cooking if the grease was saved properly. Some families kept the same jar going for weeks, layering fresh drippings on top of old ones, the flavor deepening with every pour. A grandmother who threw away grease was a grandmother who had never been hungry. That was the unspoken rule, and in a Depression-era kitchen, it was law. Number 23, rendering pork fat on a Sunday and pouring it into a coffee can for the rest of the week. A wood stove in Greenville, Mississippi, 1953. Your Big Mama cut 3 pounds of fat back into half-inch cubes, dropped them into a heavy pot with a 1/4 cup of water, and let the whole thing simmer over a low flame for 2 hours. The water cooked off, the fat melted out clear as honey. The crackling sank to the bottom, golden and crisp, ready to be salted and snacked on by any grandchild who wandered through. The clear lard went through a square of cheesecloth into a Maxwell House can on the back of the stove. That can fed her family every supper for a week, and the next and the next. The thing is, modern science didn't walk back its warnings on lard until around 2010. By then, she'd been cooking with it for 60 years and had never seen the inside of a cardiologist's office. Cooking collard greens for hours was dismissed as overcooking vegetables into mush, yet African American grandmothers knew something nutritionists took decades to confirm. The long, slow simmer breaks down tough cellulose fibers that human stomachs struggle to digest, releasing nutrients that quick-cooked greens keep locked away. Scientists now understand that extended cooking times make minerals like calcium and iron far more bioavailable. Families gathered around pots that simmered all Sunday morning, filling kitchens with that unmistakable aroma of greens seasoned with smoked meat. What seemed like patience born of tradition was actually sophisticated food science, practiced without laboratories. Those hours at the stove created meals that nourished in ways fast cooking never could. The cold pan stock for chicken defied conventional wisdom, but delivered perfect results every time. Black grandmothers placed seasoned chicken pieces into a cold cast iron skillet with solid shortening, then turned on the heat. As the pan warmed slowly, the fat rendered gradually, allowing the coating to set before the fierce sizzle began. This prevented flour from falling off and ensured the crust adhered perfectly. The chicken fried itself as temperature climbed, developing deep golden color without burning. Kitchens filled with gentle popping that grew louder as heat intensified. Children learned to judge doneness by ear as much as sight. This method required trust and patience with the slow build, but it produced crispier, more evenly cooked chicken than any hot-start method could achieve. Crackling bread started with the parts of the hog most people never thought to save. The skin and trim fat rendered down until they turned golden and crunchy, releasing grease into the pan. That grease went straight into the cornmeal batter. The cracklings folded in warm, softening the batter just enough before it hit the iron. The iron had to be blazing, hot enough to hiss on contact and form a crust before the inside could steam through. You didn't stir it. You waited for the edges to pull away from the sides, and that pull was your signal. Crackling bread had roots in West African cooking traditions where nothing from the hog ever went to waste, and that philosophy traveled into every Black Southern kitchen that followed without ever needing to be written down. The cornbread that came out was richer than anything made with butter, with a salty, smoky crunch woven through every bite. Nobody measured the cracklings. You poured until the batter looked right, and you knew it looked right because someone had shown you. Number 29, barbecued turkey tails. The tail section of a turkey carries more fat per ounce than nearly any other cut of poultry. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Black fathers bought them by the bagful because turkey processors practically gave them away. Seasoned with garlic salt, black pepper, and cayenne, then laid on the cool side of the grill until the fat rendered and the skin went crispy. They came off looking like nothing and tasting like everything. A plate of turkey tails at a cookout was a quiet flex. The cut is nearly impossible to find in most American grocery stores today. Several Pacific Island nations imported so many that health authorities pushed back and the domestic supply dried up almost overnight. Red-eye gravy was the reason you never poured out the coffee before breakfast was done. After the country ham crisped in the cast iron, that salty, smoke-cured slab that sweated its fat into the pan, she added the morning's leftover black coffee and scraped every brown bit off the bottom with a wooden spoon. The coffee and drippings swirled into a thin, dark sauce that no flour-thickened gravy could match. Historians trace red-eye gravy back to Southern kitchens of the early 1800s, where it was called poor man's gravy, bird-eye gravy, and bottom sop, all signaling one truth: nothing wasted. The red eye appeared when fat and coffee separated, forming a circle that stared up at you. You poured it over grits and sopped it with a split biscuit. The ratio came from how much coffee was left in the pot and how much ham had cooked, not from any measurement. She knew by the color. Nobody makes it like that anymore, and the reason is simple. Nobody keeps a pot of real coffee sitting all morning waiting to be useful. Before nonstick coatings and ceramic pans lined every shelf, there was cast iron, heavy and black, and passed down like jewelry. The trick was never a single act of seasoning, but years of daily use, layer after layer of rendered fat bonding to the iron through heat and repetition, building a surface so slick that eggs slid across it like water on glass. Your grandmother never read about polymerized oil. She just knew. She knew you never put soap in that skillet, never let it sit in water, never handed it to someone who did not understand. After cooking, she wiped it clean with a rag, set it back on the burner to dry, then rubbed a thin coat of grease inside before putting it away. That pan held the memory of 10,000 meals, and every one of them made the next one better. When she died, the skillet was worth more than anything else in the kitchen, not for what it cost, but for what it carried. Whoever got that pan got her hands. Nobody who grew up in one of these kitchens ever saw a measuring cup used for measuring, a palm of flour, a pour of buttermilk that looked right against the bowl, a pinch of salt tested between two fingers. This was precision of a different kind, built over years of baking the same things in the same cast iron until the hands knew more than any card could say. In West African culinary tradition, cooking by ratio and feel rather than fixed measurement was standard practice for centuries, and it traveled with the Great Migration into northern kitchens that had never heard of it. The trick is understanding relationships, not amounts. More fat means more tenderness, More acid means more rise. The women who never needed to write anything down had memorized chemistry without calling it that. And if you were lucky enough to stand beside one long enough, she handed you something no recipe card can hold.
Collard greens with smoked turkey filled Grandma's kitchen with the aroma of slow-simmered comfort that wrapped every guest in welcome before a single plate was set. She started with fresh collard leaves rinsed and torn by hand, then layered them into a heavy pot with smoked turkey necks or wings whose rich essence seeped deep into the greens as they cooked. A splash of vinegar, a pinch of red pepper flakes, and the patient heat of a low flame transformed those hearty leaves into something tender and soulful. The turkey gave a gentle smokiness while the long simmer coaxed every bit of flavor into the pot liquor that everyone wanted to sip with cornbread. This dish was a fixture at Sunday dinners, church gatherings, and weeknight suppers alike because it turned inexpensive ingredients into a meal that tasted of celebration and care. Families across the South passed down their own small twists, but the heart of the recipe remained the same: a slow dance of greens and smoke that honored heritage and nourished body and spirit. Collard greens with smoked turkey stayed on Grandma's table as a reminder that patience and tradition create flavors money alone cannot buy. Collard greens with smoked ham hocks were more than food. They were the heartbeat of Sunday dinners. The greens simmered for hours, softening slowly as the smoky richness of the ham hocks soaked into every leaf. The smell alone could fill a whole house and call everyone to the table before the pot was even ready. Black grandmothers knew just how to season it, never by measure, only by instinct. A pinch of salt here, a touch of pepper there, maybe a splash of vinegar at the end to wake up the flavor. The broth, or pot liquor, was gold, sopped up with cornbread and shared like a blessing. In those kitchens, patience was the main ingredient. Collard greens weren't just greens. They were love made visible, a slow-cooked promise that nobody in that house would ever go hungry. The tenderness came not just from time on the stove, but from time spent together.
Seasoning cast iron with bacon grease was the foundation of every Black grandmother's kitchen, transforming ordinary cookware into heirlooms passed through generations. After cooking bacon, Grandma poured the rendered fat into a tin can kept beside the stove, then used that precious grease to coat her skillets while still warm. She rubbed it in with a cloth, working the fat into every pore until it gleamed like black glass. This wasn't just maintenance, but kitchen alchemy, creating a non-stick surface superior to anything factory made. The bacon grease added flavor to everything cooked afterward, giving cornbread its golden crust and fried, and chicken its taste. Each use built upon the last, creating layers that told the story of countless family meals. Number 20, reaching for white stone ground meal. The choice was made long before the bowl ever came down off the shelf. Southern cooks did not grab the bright yellow, fine as dust meal sold in paper sacks today. They wanted white cornmeal, ground slow between stones, with the grit and the germ still in it. That coarse texture is what gave their cornbread its backbone, a little tooth in every bite instead of a soft cake crumb. The stone grinding kept the corn oil in the meal, so the bread tasted nutty and full even when there was nothing else on the plate. Yellow meal was fine for the hogs, the old saying went, but the table got white. Fresh ground meal also went rancid faster, which is why a good cook bought it in small amounts and used it quick. The lesson they carried was simple. The bread is only as good as the meal you start with, and the meal had to be real corn, not powder. Choose stone ground meal, and you're halfway to honest cornbread. Number 25, salt box pork curing. Before refrigeration reached Black homes in the rural South, salt was the only thing standing between your family and hunger. A hog was slaughtered in November when the air turned cold. Every cut was rubbed thick with coarse salt and stacked in a wooden box, layer after layer, like bricks in a wall, with salt packed between each piece. The meat sat for weeks, drawing moisture out through osmosis until bacteria could not survive on its surface. That box was the family's bank account in meat. The USDA later said this method was unreliable because home cooks could not measure salinity precisely enough. But food scientists at Texas A&M have confirmed that salt concentrations above 6% create conditions where salmonella and E. coli cannot reproduce. Your great-grandmother did not own a salinity meter. She used her hands and her mother's memory. The pork lasted through March. That was enough. Number 23, testing hot oil with the wooden spoon handle. Before a single piece of chicken hit the grease, Big Mama lowered the dry end of a wooden spoon straight down into the pot. If the wood sat there quiet, the oil was cold and the chicken would sit in it like a sponge. If a slow string of pearl bubbles climbed the handle, the oil was right around 350 degrees, the temperature every fried chicken recipe in the world will tell you to chase. If the bubbles came up fast and angry, she slid the pot off the eye and waited. No clip-on thermometer ever lived in her kitchen. The wood told the truth every time because moisture trapped in the grain reacted to the heat of the oil with predictable bubbling. And once you had seen it, you never forgot what right looked like. Her chicken came out the color of polished walnut and the crust never went soggy on the plate. Number 25, stretching meat with breadcrumbs and filler. A pound of ground beef in the 1930s was still a luxury in a sharecropper household, so grandmothers made it go further. Stale bread soaked in a little milk got crumbled and worked into the meat by hand. 1 pound became 2. The meatloaf that came out of the oven fed 8 people and nobody at the table knew half of it was bread. Some women added oatmeal instead. Others used crushed soda crackers or cold leftover rice. The principle was always the same. You never served the meat straight. You built around it, you stretched it until it covered every plate. By the time the Depression was over, this was not a survival trick anymore. It was tradition. Families kept doing it for decades because the food simply tasted right. Number 25, rinsing rice in cold water 3 times before it ever touches the pot. A blue speckled bowl on a porcelain sink in 1949 Charleston. Your big mama poured the long grain in, swirled it twice with her fingers, and tipped the cloudy water down the drain. She did it again, and then a 3rd time until the water ran clear as a creek in March. What most people miss is that supermarket rice came dusted with talc and broken starch, the kind that'd turn a pot of clean white rice into glue by supper time. Edna Lewis wrote about this same trick in her notebooks from Freetown. The rice, once rinsed, sat in a cast iron pot with a pinch of salt and a tablespoon of bacon fat, simmered 18 minutes, and lifted off the spoon in single grains that held their shape under a ladle of pot lacquer. Modern cooks call it gourmet technique. Your big mama called it Wednesday. Drinking pot liquor from greens was a practice that made outsiders cringe. Yet African American families treasured every drop of that dark, rich cooking liquid. Modern nutrition research confirms what grandmothers always knew, that broth contains concentrated vitamins and minerals that leach from the greens during cooking. Scientists discovered pot liquor holds more nutritional value than the vegetables themselves, packed with water-soluble vitamins B and C. Families would sip it warm from cups or soak cornbread until it softened into a nourishing meal. During lean times, this liquid gold stretched resources while delivering essential nutrition. What doctors now call nutrient-dense broth, Black families simply called pot liquor, and they never wasted a single precious drop. Seasoning the skillet with bacon grease was ritual passed from mother to daughter in Black kitchens throughout the 1950s South. After every use, grandmothers wiped their cast iron clean with a cloth, never soap, then rubbed warm bacon grease across the surface while the pan still held heat. This created a natural coating that deepened with every meal. The grease filled tiny pores in the iron, preventing rust and creating a glossy finish that announced years of careful tending. Children watched closely, understanding that a well-seasoned skillet was family treasure. Some pans had been seasoned for decades, their surfaces smoother than any modern coating. The grease added subtle depth to everything cooked afterward, meaning eggs carried traces of yesterday's breakfast. This technique transformed ordinary iron into heirloom vessels. The pot liquor was never the leftover, it was the whole point. After a mess of greens simmered for hours with a ham bone or salt pork, what remained was a dark, potent broth, tangy with vinegar and rich with pork fat, carrying every mineral the greens had surrendered to the water. George Key, born enslaved in Arkansas, described meals of greens and pot liquor as daily sustenance, and that tradition carried forward unbroken for more than a century. You tore off a piece of cornbread and dropped it in, or you tipped the pot and drank from a cup. Some households saved their pot liquor like stock poured into jars. For the week, stirred into dry beans, used to start the next pot of greens. The broth served as a healing remedy too, given to sick children when solid food felt like too much. What wealthier kitchens threw away, these households turned into medicine and into the richest thing on the table. Number 30, barbecued duck. In the Mississippi Delta, East Arkansas, and the bayou parishes of Louisiana, a father who hunted waterfowl brought ducks home and grilled them whole over hickory. Wild duck was leaner and tougher than store-bought poultry, and it needed slow heat and constant basting to keep from drying out. A father split the bird down the center, seasoned it with salt, pepper, and garlic, and mopped it with thin vinegar sauce for 2 hours until the skin went dark and the fat underneath melted clean through the meat. Duck at a cookout was a hunter's offering. It meant a man had walked into the marsh before dawn and come back with something worth putting on the fire. When hunting traditions faded and wild game stopped showing up at family gatherings, the cookout duck disappeared with the men who brought it. Soaking greens in salt water was non-negotiable, a step Black grandmothers never skipped, regardless of time constraints. Collards, mustards, and turnip greens came from gardens carrying dirt, sand, and sometimes unwanted guests hiding in their leaves. Grandma filled her sink with cold water, added a generous handful of salt, and submerged those greens for at least 30 minutes. The salt drew out grit and convinced stubborn insects to abandon their hiding places. She lifted the greens out, drained the water, then repeated until it ran perfectly clear. This patience showed respect for the food and the people eating it. Serving gritty greens was a kitchen sin no self-respecting grandmother would commit, and this simple saltwater bath ensured clean, tender leaves every time. Number 18, mixing the batter with buttermilk, never sweet milk. Plain milk made a flat, dull bread, and these cooks knew it. They reached for buttermilk, thick and sour, left over from churning or simply turned on the back of the counter. That tang did two jobs at once. It seasoned the bread with a faint sharpness that played against the sweet corn, and its acid woke up the leavening so the crumb rose light instead of dense. The sourness also tenderized the meal, softening the grit and leaving the crumb fine. Buttermilk kept the inside moist as well, which mattered when the bread had to stretch across a long table and still taste good cold the next morning. In poorer kitchens, when the cow's milk had gone past fresh and turned thick, that was no waste at all. Soured milk was exactly what the recipe wanted, and the more it had clabbered, the better the bread. Nothing on a southern farm got thrown out if it could feed somebody first, and a turned jug of milk was simply tomorrow's cornbread waiting. A cook who understood buttermilk understood that sour was not spoiled, it was flavor and lift waiting to be used. Sweet milk made a pale, lazy loaf by comparison. Pour in the buttermilk and the bread will thank you. Number 22, smoke curing with green hickory. In the smokehouse behind nearly every black homestead in the rural South, hams and shoulders hung from rafters above a smoldering pit of green hickory wood. The smoke was not just for flavor, it was chemistry in the air, invisible and exact. The phenols in wood smoke acted as antioxidants that slowed fat breakdown. The formaldehyde and acetic acid lowered the pH on the surface of the meat, creating an antimicrobial barrier that worked around the clock. A properly smoked ham lasted an entire year hanging in that smokehouse. The USDA declared backyard smokehouses unsanitary in the mid-20th century because temperatures could not be precisely controlled. But the compounds in hickory smoke do the same work whether you monitor them with a thermometer or not. Your grandfather knew the smoke was ready when it smelled right. He read that smokehouse the way a doctor reads a chart. He could not name a single phenol. He did not need to. Number 22, seasoning the heavy iron pan with bacon fat. The heavy black pan on the back of Big Mama's stove was older than her grown children, and it shone like wet stone every morning. After every meal, she rinsed it clean with hot water, never soap, dried it on a hot burner so no bead of moisture could sit on the metal, and rubbed a thin film of bacon fat across the cooking surface with a folded square of paper bag. That single thin coat baked into the iron by the residual heat was what kept the pan from rusting and kept the next batch of cornbread from sticking. By the end of a decade, the surface was as slick as glass. By the end of 3 decades, the pan was an heirloom. The science behind it is simple. Animal fat polymerizes under heat into a slick, durable layer that bonds to the iron at the molecular level. Big Mama did not need the word polymerize. She knew that bacon fat made the pan behave, and that lard worked too in a pinch, and that vegetable oil never quite gave you the same finish. More than that, she knew the pan itself was an inheritance. The skillet she used had been her mother's and her mother's mother's before that. Every meal cooked in it left a faint trace of itself in the seasoning. So the cornbread you ate on a Tuesday in 1972 carried something of every Sunday dinner that came before. The iron held the memory the same way the family held the recipes, and she handed both down to whichever daughter showed up most often in the kitchen. By federal census data, more than 70% of Black Southern households in 1950 owned at least one heavy iron pan, and most of those pans are still cooking today. That is a survival rate no non-stick pan will ever match. Number 22, planning every meal for the week before spending a single cent. A Depression-era grandmother did not walk into a store and figure it out as she went. She sat down at the kitchen table on Saturday night with a pencil and a scrap of paper and wrote out exactly what the family would eat for the next 7 days. Monday was beans and cornbread because the beans needed time to soak. Tuesday used whatever greens came out of the garden. Wednesday was the leftover beans mashed into patties and fried in the skillet. Thursday, she might stretch a piece of salt pork across a pot of rice. Every meal connected to the one before it, and every ingredient had a destination before it ever came through the door. She knew to the ounce how much flour the week required, how many eggs she needed, and whether the lard tin would last. If it did not add up, she adjusted the plan, not the budget. Walking into a grocery store without a list was considered reckless, the same as leaving the front door wide open in a rainstorm. That weekly plan turned a handful of cheap staples into 21 meals without a single scrap going uneaten. Number 24, knocking the cast iron skillet to test the heat before the lard ever went in. A Kentucky kitchen in 1958. The pan had been her mother's, then her aunt's, then hers. Big Mama would drum the iron rim with the back of her wooden spoon and listen for the change in pitch, a low, ringing tone that said the pan was ready. Cold iron answered dull. Hot iron answered like a bell. Once the bell rang, she dropped a pinch of cornmeal into the dry pan. If the meal danced and browned in 3 seconds, the chicken went in. If it didn't, she waited a beat longer. There wasn't a thermometer, an infrared gun, or an app. There was a woman, an iron pan, and 40 years of knowing. The fried chicken came out crackling. The skin shattered. The meat was juicy enough to drip down the wrist of the child who ate it, standing at the counter. Year after year, that same pan rang the same bell. The grease-saving ritual was sacred practice in Black kitchens where nothing went to waste. After frying, grandmothers let grease cool slightly, then strained it through cheesecloth into ceramic crocks kept beside the stove. This collected grease contained concentrated flavor from countless meals, bacon, chicken, fish, all mingling into liquid gold. The containers were never washed, only replenished, creating layers of seasoning that deepened over months. When cooking began, a spoonful of saved grease went into the skillet first, adding depth that fresh oil could never provide. Children understood this murky fat represented economy and flavor combined. The ritual continued daily without fanfare, simply part of kitchen rhythm. Modern cooks might cringe, but this technique delivered taste that made even simple vegetables memorable. Tomato gravy was what happened when there was no meat for drippings and no milk for white gravy, but there was always a can of tomatoes and bacon grease in the jar by the stove. You started with the fat, let it get hot, worked in a spoonful of flour, and stirred until the raw smell cooked off. The canned tomatoes went in next, crushed by hand over the pan, and the whole thing simmered down into something thick and rust-colored, seasoned with salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. It went over biscuits, over rice, over whatever bread was on the table. Through the Depression years and the lean stretches of the 1940s, this meal cost pennies per serving and appeared on Black Southern tables with the reliability of sunrise. It wasn't company food, it was Tuesday. And yet, people today who try to recreate it exactly, same can of tomatoes, same grease, same flour, find something still comes out wrong. The flavor lived in the hands that made it and in the unhurried pace of the stirring, in the way she never rushed a roux because she had nowhere else to be. But years before that dish reached any holiday table, something simpler had been feeding families every weeknight. Number 27, grilled pork steaks. In St. Louis and the small towns lining both sides of the Mississippi, Black fathers grilled pork steaks the way other men grilled burgers. The pork steak is a crosscut from the shoulder blade, bone still in, sold cheap because most people considered it a second-rate cut. A father seasoned them the night before, grilled them low over charcoal until the fat cap melted into the meat, then finished them in a foil pan with barbecue sauce until the whole thing went tender enough to fall apart with a fork. That was supper 3 or 4 nights a week in the summer. The cut is still sold in St. Louis. Outside of it, most people have never heard of a pork steak. The tea rinse came after the hot comb. She'd brew a strong pot of black tea, not the pale kind, but the kind that turned water the color of old wood, and let it cool on the counter while she finished pressing your hair. When the iron was put away, she poured the cool tea slowly over your scalp and worked it down to the ends. This was a practice tracing to West African beauty traditions, where black tea's high tannin content had long been used to seal the hair cuticle, add shine, and reduce breakage in tightly coiled hair. Tannins in strong brewed black tea bind to protein in the hair shaft, temporarily strengthening it, which is why hair poured over with a tea rinse sat smoother and reflected more light. She didn't know the chemistry. She knew the result. She learned it from the woman who pressed her hair, who learned it from the woman before. A pot of tea was never just tea in those kitchens. It was hair care, medicine, the quiet rhythm of a Saturday afternoon that began before you were old enough to hold still. That ritual went with her. Every black kitchen had one, and you knew exactly where it sat. The coffee can, sometimes a mason jar, sometimes an old Crisco tin, lived on the back of the stove or just beside it, always within reach. After every pan of bacon, every batch of fried pork chops, the grease got poured through a strainer, or sometimes just a piece of cheesecloth draped over the rim. That rendered fat became the foundation of nearly everything, from eggs fried until the edges went lacy and crisp, to green beans simmered low with onion, and a dollop of that golden fat stirred in at the start. During the Great Migration, families carried their grease cans north to Chicago and Detroit, and during the Second World War, the government actually asked households to save their cooking fat for the war effort, turning a kitchen habit into patriotic duty. She just called it Tuesday, and the woman who kept that can full was the one whose kitchen always smelled like something good was about to happen. You could hear it before you saw it. The moment that batter hit the iron, there was a sound, a hard, immediate sizzle, like the pan was sealing a deal, and you knew the crust was already forming on the bottom before the top had even set. That sound was the trick. The cast iron had been heating in the oven for at least 10 minutes, and when cold batter touched that surface, the fat drove moisture into instant steam, puffing the inside while the outside crisped. This is why cornbread baked in a cold dish and cornbread baked in a screaming hot cast iron are two entirely different creatures from the exact same batter. African American cooks across the South understood this long before food science had a word for it. The skillet went in first always, and the batter went in last. You poured fast because every second of contact between cold batter and hot iron was building that crust. The dark gold bottom, slightly smoky from the seasoned surface, that was not an accident. That was something learned by listening.
Buttermilk biscuits rose in the oven like soft clouds, their buttery layers promising warmth and comfort from the very first scent that drifted through the house. Grandma mixed flour, salt, and baking powder with cold bits of butter and tangy buttermilk, working the dough gently so it stayed tender. She cut the rounds with an old drinking glass and set them close together on a heavy baking sheet so they would rise high and share their heat. When they emerged golden brown and steaming, everyone gathered quickly, eager to split them open while they were still too hot to hold. Honey, syrup, or gravy turned each biscuit into its own small feast, while a smear of jam added a sweet note that made even a simple morning feel special. These biscuits were never reserved for grand occasions. They appeared beside fried chicken with collard greens or next to a bowl of beans, grounding every meal in home and heart. Their flaky layers carried the memory of many hands that had shaped them, and the quiet pride of a cook who knew that the simplest bread could bring a family together again and again. Okra gumbo was a stew that told an entire history in one pot. It started with a roux, flour and oil stirred low and slow until it turned deep brown, like roasted nuts. Then came the okra, tomatoes, onions, and sometimes sausage or shrimp, depending on what the day offered. The pot thickened as it simmered, rich with flavor and memory. Black grandmothers stood over it with wooden spoons, never rushing, knowing that gumbo was as much about patience as it was about spice. Served over rice, every bowl felt like home. Each region had its version, each family its secret. Gumbo carried Africa, the Caribbean, and the American South together, all in one dish. It wasn't just food, it was heritage, preserved through hands that remembered more than words ever could. Some grandmothers swore by a little file powder, Others said the secret was in the stir, but all agreed you had to cook it with care, never anger. The smell alone brought people running because gumbo meant company. You could taste the generations in it, the stories, the laughter, and the love that survived every hardship.
Keeping brown sugar soft with bread was kitchen wisdom that saved countless batches of cookies, cakes, and candied yams from disaster. Black grandmothers knew brown sugar turned into a rock-hard brick if left alone too long, making it impossible to measure. Her solution was elegantly simple. She placed a slice of fresh white bread directly in the sugar container and sealed it tight. Within a day or two, the sugar absorbed moisture from the bread, returning to its soft, scoopable state. The bread became stale, having sacrificed its moisture for the greater good. This trick meant Grandma always had workable brown sugar ready, never having to chip away at a solid mass. It was resourcefulness solving problems with what was already in the kitchen. Number 17, the cast iron skillet itself. No tool in the southern kitchen carried more weight, and not just the literal kind. For most families, through most of these years, the heavy black pan was not one choice among many. It was the only pan there was. Everything came out of it: the cornbread and the fried chicken, the beans, the gravy, the eggs at dawn. It was bought once and meant to last a lifetime, and it usually outlasted the cook. A good skillet was never scrubbed down to bare metal. The thin layer of cooked-in fat, the seasoning, was guarded like money because it was money in a way. That black sheen meant the bread released clean and the crust browned even, with no flour and no fuss. When a pan was passed from a mother to a daughter, it came already seasoned by years of cornbread and pork fat, carrying the memory of every meal cooked before. That was the real inheritance, more than any china. The deeper history sits in the iron too. Many of these pans came up through plantation kitchens, where enslaved black women fed everyone and cooked over open hearths with whatever they were given, turning the cheapest meal into something that tasted like care. The skill of reading a hot pan by sound and smell, of knowing the exact moment to pour, was learned hard and handed down on purpose, one of the few things that could be kept and passed along when so much else was taken. So the skillet was never just a skillet, it was a record of who taught whom, a tool that held heat and held history at the same time. A grandmother's pan was her signature, and the cornbread it made was proof the lesson had been received. Treat the iron with respect and it will outlast you too. Number 23, lard sealing. After rendering hog fat over a low fire until it turned white and clean, your grandmother poured that liquid lard over cooked meats in a crock until the fat covered every surface by at least an inch. When the lard cooled and solidified, it created an airtight seal like a wax lid that no bacteria could penetrate. The meat stayed preserved for months in a root cellar without any refrigeration at all. Families in the Delta kept crocks of lard-sealed pork in their cellars all winter. Health officials in the 1950s called this method dangerous and unsanitary. Modern food science tells a different story. Rendered lard, stored in a cool environment, creates an anaerobic barrier that prevents oxidation and microbial growth. French chefs call this technique confit and charge you $40 a plate. Black women in Mississippi called it putting up meat and charged nothing. Today's gourmet is yesterday's survival. Number 20, stretching tough cuts of meat with buttermilk overnight. When the round steak was the cheap kind, the kind that could turn into shoe leather under the wrong hand, Big Mama reached for the buttermilk crock. She would lay the meat flat in a deep bowl, pour cold buttermilk over the top until the steak was fully covered, and slide the bowl into the icebox before she went to bed. The next morning, the same cut that would have fought a fork the night before was relaxed and pliable, ready to be breaded and pan-fried into chicken fried steak that you could cut with the edge of a butter knife. The trick is lactic acid. The mild acid in cultured buttermilk slowly breaks down tough muscle fibers without ever turning the surface mushy the way stronger acids will. Vinegar moves too fast, wine moves too sharp. Buttermilk moves the speed of grandmother time, slow and patient and gentle, which was exactly the right speed for cheap meat and a house full of mouths to feed by morning. Nothing else worked as well, and she always had a quart of buttermilk on hand for biscuits anyway. Number 21, buying the cuts of meat nobody else wanted. Neck bones, pig feet, chicken backs and gizzards, oxtails, back when they cost almost nothing and the butcher practically gave them away. White customers walked right past these cuts at the counter, and black grandmothers picked them up for pennies a pound. The trick was knowing what low heat and long time could do to a piece of meat that looked like scrap. Braised neck bones fell off the bone after 4 hours in a covered pot. Pig feet turned into a rich, gelatinous stew that warmed a house on a January night. Chicken backs made a stock so deep it became the base for everything else that week. These women did not buy cheap cuts because they lacked taste. They bought them because they had more skill than the people paying 3 times the price for something easier to cook. Number 21, salting the meat the night before you cook. It, a Birmingham kitchen in 1955. Big Mama unwrapped a pork shoulder from the butcher paper and rubbed kosher salt deep into the fat cap with both hands. She covered it loose with a dish towel and slid it onto the cool side of the icebox. By morning, the salt had drawn the moisture to the surface, then pulled it back in along with every grain of seasoning. The meat cooked tender enough to fall off the bone with the back of a fork. Restaurant chefs would later call this a dry brine and write whole books about it. Big Mama called it leaving the meat alone overnight. She had learned the same trick from her own grandmother, who had learned it on a tobacco farm in 1898. The salt did the same work in every kitchen. The patience was the seasoning. Cooking with cast iron skillets was standard practice in African American kitchens long before scientists discovered the pans actually fortified food with dietary iron. Research confirms that acidic foods like tomatoes and greens cooked in cast iron absorb significant amounts of the mineral, helping prevent anemia in communities with limited access to red meat. Those heavy black pans passed down through generations were doing double duty as cookware and nutritional supplements. Grandmothers seasoned their skillets with lard, building layers of natural non-stick coating that modern chemists struggle to replicate safely. What seemed like stubborn attachment to old equipment was actually health intervention disguised as tradition. Scientists now recommend cast iron cooking for the same benefits black cooks enjoyed for centuries. Double frying for extra crispy results was a technique black grandmothers used when nothing less than perfection would do. The first fry cooked food through at moderate temperature, sealing moisture and setting the crust. Then pieces rested on wire racks while oil heated higher. The second fry lasted only minutes, but transformed the exterior into something shatteringly crisp while the inside stayed tender. This method worked especially well for chicken and fish destined for Sunday dinner tables. The resting period allowed steam to escape, preventing sogginess that plagued single fry methods. Grandmothers timed both stages precisely, knowing seconds mattered. The extra effort showed in every bite, the crust crackling loudly between teeth. Children fought over the crispiest pieces, understanding this food represented extra love. The can of pink salmon cost next to nothing. and it came with every bit of the fish, including the soft, edible bones that Grandma mashed right in because those bones were calcium and she wasn't throwing calcium away. The salmon got flaked into a bowl, mixed with cornmeal, a beaten egg, chopped onion, and black pepper, then shaped into patties with wet hands and laid into a skillet of hot grease. Cornmeal served as binding and crust at once, holding the patties together while crisping them gold on both sides. By the 1940s and 50s, canned salmon had become a staple protein in Black Southern households because it was affordable, shelf-stable, and asked nothing of you in terms of equipment. A single can fed 4 people with enough cornmeal to stretch it. What came out of that skillet had a crispy shell and a tender center, and it sat well on rice or beside dried beans. The recipe still exists. The woman who made it by feel, pressing each patty until it held without asking how, does not. Number 24, smoked turkey wings. A single turkey wing weighs close to a pound, and in the 1970s, they were among the cheapest poultry cuts in the case. Black fathers rubbed them with seasoning salt, smoked paprika, and black pepper, then set them on the grate far from the heat and let the smoke work. 2 hours later, the skin had gone the color of dark honey, and the meat pulled clean off the bone in long strips. At family reunions, the turkey wings always ran out first. They had the richness of dark meat with the smokiness of a rib, and they cost a fraction of either. The wing fell out of favor when turkey processors began marketing whole breasts and tenderloins, and the cheap cuts vanished from the shelf. The richest chocolate cake in the kitchen came from the simplest trick: leftover brewed coffee poured straight into the batter in place of water. Black coffee still in the pot from that morning. No one called it a technique. It was just what you did when the cocoa was cheap and the water made the cake taste flat. The science, which nobody had a name for at the time, was this: the mild acidity in coffee intensifies cocoa's natural bitterness, pulling out flavor compounds that heat alone can't reach. Depression-era bakers stumbled onto this while stretching scarce dairy during the 1930s, discovering that coffee-moistened chocolate cake needed neither eggs nor butter to taste extraordinary. In Black households where the pot went on at dawn and sat until the last cup was claimed, there was always some left over by the time afternoon baking started. She poured until the batter looked right, deep brown, loose enough to drop from the spoon. You could not taste the coffee in the finished cake. You could only taste that it was better than anyone else's. The recipe card said liquid. It meant coffee if you knew. If the sound of hot grease was the first lesson, the sink full of greens was the second. Nobody skipped the washing, and nobody washed them only once. Collards came in from the garden or the market with grit buried in every fold, tiny grains of sand that no amount of shaking could remove, and sometimes a caterpillar curled tight against the stem. The first wash was cold water and a splash of vinegar, leaves pulled apart and swirled until the water turned brown. Drain, fill again. Second wash, same thing. Slower now, each leaf turned over and inspected. Third wash, and if the water still showed dirt, a fourth. Some women soaked the greens in salt water for an hour before the washing even started. You never rushed it. A single grain of sand in a finished pot could ruin Sunday dinner, and the woman who served gritty greens would hear about it for years. That ritual at the sink was not cleaning. It was preparation, patience, and proof that you respected the people who were going to eat. There was always a tin. It sat near the burner, dented and dark, with a lid that never quite closed right, and it was one of the most important pieces of equipment in the kitchen. Every time something came out of a pan, the drippings went in. the fat from salt pork, the leavings after the sausage was done, the amber oil left after cornbread came out. By the end of the week, that tin held a layered history of everything cooked, and it was the starting fat for nearly everything baked. Bacon grease keeps baked goods from sticking in a way butter never can. The smoke point is higher, the flavor deeper, and the way it coats seasoned cast iron before baking creates a seal that Crisco or spray oil cannot replicate. African American families across the South carried this practice from the 19th century straight through the 1970s. The ones who kept their tin long after health trends said otherwise. Their cornbread tasted different, richer, like something had been built into it slowly over years, because it had.
Black-eyed peas with ham hock simmered in a pot that whispered of prosperity and hope, especially when the new year arrived and families sought good fortune. Grandma soaked the peas overnight, then cooked them slowly with a smoked ham hock whose savory marrow enriched every bean. Aromatic onions, garlic, and bay leaves infused the broth while the peas grew tender and creamy, carrying a gentle earthiness that tasted of comfort. On New Year's Day, the dish held special meaning, each pea symbolizing a coin of luck for the year ahead. But it was welcome at ordinary suppers too, because it fed many with little cost. Served over fluffy rice or beside warm cornbread, it brought everyone to the table in quiet celebration of heritage and resilience. The ham hock's deep flavor reminded diners of the tradition of using every part of the animal, a practice born from necessity and cherished as wisdom. Black-eyed peas with ham hock remained more than food. It was a ritual of faith and family, a sustaining dish that connected generations through shared hope and delicious memory. Fried catfish with cornmeal crust was the taste of Friday nights when payday met patience. Cleaned and seasoned with salt, pepper, and a grandmother's wisdom, the catfish was dredged in cornmeal and dropped gently into a pan of hot oil. The sizzle said it all, golden crust forming, flesh tender beneath. No recipe was written. Each family had its way. Some added paprika, others a little mustard. All made sure the fish was fried just right. Crispy edges, flaky center. Served with hush puppies or white bread, maybe a drizzle of hot sauce, it was joy you could hold in your hands. Black grandmothers turned this humble catch into a feast, feeding family, neighbors, and anyone who stopped by. Each bite was a reminder that simplicity, when done with care, could taste like abundance. Fried catfish was proof that mastery didn't come from money. It came from heart. The frying pan was like a stage, and Grandma was the conductor, listening to the rhythm of the oil, watching the color of the crust, knowing exactly when to lift each piece. A paper towel-lined plate sat ready to catch the fresh batch, steaming and golden, ready to disappear. The first taste was always the best, hot, seasoned, alive with memory.
Tenderizing tough meat with cola was a Depression-era trick Black grandmothers swore by when working with cheap, stubborn cuts that threatened to stay chewy. Grandma poured a bottle of cola over brisket, roast, or pork shoulder, letting it marinate overnight before slow cooking the next day. The phosphoric acid broke down tough muscle fibers while sugars caramelized during cooking, creating a glaze both sweet and savory. This technique turned budget cuts into meals tasting expensive, proving ingenuity could overcome limited grocery money. Families who couldn't afford prime beef still ate tender, flavorful meat because Grandma understood cooking chemistry without formal education. The cola trick became legendary in Black kitchens, whispered between neighbors, and shared at church gatherings. Number 15, letting baking soda and buttermilk do the lifting. Old cooks did not trust a tall stack of leavening, and they did not need it. A pinch of soda stirred into the meal, then met with sour buttermilk, set off a quiet chemical rise the moment the two touched. The acid in the buttermilk and the soda fizzed against each other, lifting the crumb just enough to keep it tender without turning it into spongy cake. That is why the batter went into the hot pan fast before the bubbles could fade and flatten. Wait too long and the rise was gone, leaving a dense, heavy bread that sat in your stomach like a stone. Some hands used a little baking powder too, but the buttermilk and soda pairing was the older way, learned back when store leavening was dear and a careful cook stretched every spoonful she had. It also balanced the sour, since the soda took the sharp edge off the tang and left a clean corn flavor behind. The whole reaction cost a pinch of powder and a moment's attention. Stir the soda into the meal, then move quick. Number 21, vinegar pepper sauce. Every kitchen table in the Black South had a bottle of vinegar with hot peppers floating inside. It was not a condiment, it was a preservation system disguised as a table sauce. The peppers released capsaicin into the vinegar over time, creating a solution with both antimicrobial and antioxidant properties. You shook it over greens, beans, rice, or anything that needed brightening. When the vinegar ran low, you poured more in. The same peppers lasted for months, sometimes years. Some families passed the same bottle down through an entire growing season, refilling it the way you top off a gas tank. Food safety officials warned against storing peppers in vinegar at room temperature because the pH might not be low enough to prevent botulism. But vinegar sits at a pH between 2.4 and 3.4, well below the 4.6 threshold where Clostridium botulinum can grow. The science was on your grandmother's side the entire time. She just never got the credit. Number 21, tenderizing tough greens with a splash of vinegar. The collards that came up out of the fall garden after the first frost was sweeter, but the leaves were leathery enough to resolve a shoe. Big Mama dealt with them by tipping a small splash of apple cider vinegar into the simmering pot about an hour in, and then she let the greens go for another 60 to 90 minutes without lifting the lid more than twice. The mild acid in the vinegar breaks down the tough cellulose in mature greens, which is why the leaves end up silky instead of stringy. It also cuts the natural bitterness that lives in the stems. She never measured the splash. She knew the right amount by the smell that rose off the pot, somewhere between sharp and sweet, and she trusted the pot to tell her when the greens had given in. The pot liquor at the bottom was the prize, dark and savory, ready to be sopped up with a square of warm cornbread. Number 20, bartering eggs and garden vegetables with neighbors instead of spending cash. Money was scarce, but eggs were currency. A grandmother with 6 laying hens had something better than coins in her apron pocket. She traded a dozen eggs for a quart of milk from the woman down the road. She swapped a basket of ripe tomatoes for a sack of cornmeal. The system ran on trust and it ran without a receipt. Whole blocks and entire rural roads operated this way during the worst years. No middleman, no markup, no store, just 2 women standing at a fence line on a Tuesday morning deciding what their families needed that week and making it happen with what they already had. There is a reason these tricks worked, and it was not luck. Black grandmothers during the Depression were operating inside a system that was built to keep them poor. Sharecropping meant debt before the first seed hit the ground. Jim Crow meant the better paying jobs were locked behind a door they could not open. Redlining meant the neighborhoods with the cheapest groceries were the neighborhoods they were not allowed to live in, so they built a parallel economy inside their own kitchens. Every trick on this list is a workaround invented by women who got no help and expected none. The grocery bill was the one fight where intelligence and discipline could win against a rigged system, and they won it every single week, not with coupons, not with charity, with knowledge passed from mother to daughter while standing over a hot stove. Number 22, soaking dried beans overnight with a teaspoon of baking soda in the water. A Memphis kitchen in 1962. Big Mama dropped a pound of dried pintos into a chipped enamel bowl, covered them with cold water, and stirred in a single teaspoon of soda from the orange box on the shelf. The beans drank the water, the skins softened. The soda neutralized the gas compounds that had ruined a Sunday afternoon. By morning, the beans had doubled in size. She drained them, rinsed them once, and simmered them with a smoked ham hock and one chopped onion. The pot took 90 minutes instead of 4 hours. She saved gas, she saved time, she saved your granddaddy the embarrassment of a long car ride home from church. The trick traveled with her family from Tennessee to Detroit during the Great Migration, and her granddaughter was still doing it in a Cleveland apartment in 1991. Marinating meat in buttermilk was a technique African American cooks used to transform tough, inexpensive cuts into tender meals that rivaled expensive steaks. Food scientists now understand that buttermilk's lactic acid gently breaks down muscle fibers without turning meat mushy, while calcium helps proteins retain moisture during cooking. Research confirms that buttermilk marinades penetrate deeper than vinegar, creating tenderness throughout rather than just on the surface. Grandmothers would submerge chicken pieces overnight before dredging in seasoned flour, producing fried chicken so tender it fell off the bone. What seemed like folk wisdom was precise food chemistry that restaurants now employ deliberately. Black cooks mastered meat tenderization through observation long before laboratories confirmed their methods. The bread test for oil temperature was how Black grandmothers knew exactly when their grease was ready without any thermometer. A small cube of stale bread dropped into hot fat told the whole story. If it sank and sat motionless, the oil needed more time. If it browned too quickly, the heat was too high. But when that bread cube floated immediately, sizzled steadily, and turned golden in about 60 seconds, the grease was perfect for frying. This technique had been passed down through generations who never owned thermometers. Grandmothers could also read oil by watching its surface shimmer and ripple. Children learned to recognize that particular sizzle sound that meant perfect temperature. The bread test was simple, reliable, and cost nothing. Proof that good cooking came from observation rather than equipment. The bean pie didn't come from a Southern grandmother's kitchen. It came from something more deliberate. The Nation of Islam introduced it in the 1930s as a direct alternative to sweet potato pie, part of a broader push to shift African American eating habits toward foods the organization considered nutritious and self-sufficient. Navy beans were cooked down, sweetened, seasoned with nutmeg, cinnamon, and vanilla, and baked into a custard that tasted nothing like its name suggested. Smooth, faintly spiced, richer than anything made from dried beans had any right to be. By the 1950s and 60s, NOI mosques in Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles were selling bean pies from street tables out of the hands of young men in bow ties who moved through Black neighborhoods as both vendors and community. If you grew up near a mosque or in a household the NOI had touched, you knew exactly what it was. If you hadn't, you might have gone your whole life never tasting one. The gap was deliberate. The pie belonged to the community that made it. Number 21, barbecued beef short ribs. Before beef short ribs became a $40 entree at steakhouses in Brooklyn and Chicago, they sat in the meat case of every Black neighborhood butcher in the South, priced to move because nobody wanted them. The bone was thick, the fat cap was heavy, the meat between the bones was dark, tough, and riddled with connective tissue that most cooks did not know how to handle. But a Black father with a charcoal grill and a Saturday afternoon knew exactly what to do. The ribs went on bone side down, far from the heat, with the lid closed and a pan of water set underneath to keep the air moist. The temperature stayed low. Hours passed. Nobody checked. Nobody poked. The collagen dissolved into gelatin. The fat rendered slowly through the meat instead of dripping into the fire. What came off that grill bore no resemblance to what went on. The finished rib was dark on the outside, nearly black, with meat so tender it separated from the bone under its own weight. A whole slab cost less than $5 in the 1970s, and a man could feed 3 families from one purchase. The grandchildren who ate those ribs off paper plates in the backyard now see the same cut braised in red wine on white linen in restaurant windows, sold for more per rib than their grandfather paid for the whole slab. Nobody asked those men how they did it. Nobody credited the tradition. The restaurant industry took the cut, raised the price, and pretended it had discovered something new. Coffee grounds on the meat, spent ones, still damp from the morning pot, was a technique that lived in African American kitchens long before any restaurant put it on a menu. The grounds went on to tougher cuts: pork shoulder, beef chuck, venison from the hunt, pressed into the surface with the heel of the hand 2 or 3 hours before the fire. The acids in permit spent coffee grounds, denature surface proteins, breaking down connective tissue and allowing the interior to cook more evenly, which is why Shirley May's Cafe in Louisville, Kentucky, a storied soul food institution, famously added coffee to their meatloaf. In households where the cheapest cuts were the only cuts, this knowledge was survival arithmetic. No store-bought tenderizer, no extra marinade ingredient, just the grounds that would have gone into the garden or the trash, pressed flat against the meat and left to work. The grounds came off before cooking. The flavor stayed. The cut that came out of that skillet tasted like it had cost twice what it did, and that was the point. Not to impress anyone, but to make sure nobody at this table went without a satisfying meal. There was no thermometer clipped to the side of the pot, no digital readout blinking on the counter. She knew the oil was ready because she heard it, a flick of water from wet fingertips, a tiny crackle of flour pinched and dropped from above, or just the sound the grease made when it hit that precise shimmer, a low hiss shifting into a sharp, confident pop the moment something touched the surface. That sound meant 350 degrees, give or take, and she was never wrong. Kids learned to stay back when the popping started. They also learned to listen, because one day they would stand over that pot themselves. The women who fried fish on Friday nights could judge temperature by ear, the way a piano tuner judges pitch, and the chicken that came out of their oil was golden every single time. Nobody fries with that same ear anymore, because nobody stands close enough long enough to learn. The buttermilk might be a workaround, but the fat was never negotiable. Before the dough was started, the butter, or lard, if that was what the kitchen kept, went to the coldest available place, the windowsill in winter, the back of the icebox, or a glass of cold water if nothing else worked. Cold fat is the entire secret to a flaky biscuit. When cold butter hits a hot oven, it creates pockets of steam as it suddenly releases, and those pockets become layers. Southern black bakers understood this for generations, even when the explanation lived in muscle memory rather than in words. The rule was simple: never let the fat warm up, work fast, and don't overwork the dough, because overworking activates gluten, and tight gluten is the enemy of a tender biscuit. You could feel when the dough was right, and you could feel the second it went wrong that you had held it one touch too long.
Okra and tomatoes brought garden freshness and gentle southern tang to Grandma's table, a skillet dish that shimmered with color and flavor. She began by sautéing onions and garlic in a splash of oil until fragrant, then added sliced okra whose emerald pods softened as they released a subtle richness. Ripe tomatoes followed, their juices mingling with the okra to create a sauce that thickened naturally without losing its bright edge. A sprinkle of salt, pepper, and a pinch of cayenne lent quiet heat, while a final dash of vinegar balanced the sweetness. Served over rice or alongside cornbread, the dish celebrated the summer harvest and the creativity of cooks who turned what grew in their yards into sustaining meals. Children learned to love the gentle texture, and adults cherished the reminder of long, warm afternoons spent in shared gardens. Okra and tomatoes carried the history of African and Southern influences, blending flavors that traveled across oceans and generations. Each bite held the memory of backyard plots, community markets, and the patient hands that knew how to turn simple vegetables into food worth gathering around with gratitude and joy. Smothered pork chops were the kind of meal that made the whole house quiet, except for the sound of gravy bubbling on the stove. You could smell it before you saw it. Thick onion gravy wrapping around fried pork until every bite turned tender and soft. It was never rushed, never careless, always cooked slow enough for the flavor to find its way inside. Families saved their best pan for it, the one that had seen birthdays and Sunday dinners and still held the shine of memory. There was pride in turning a cheap cut of meat into something that felt rich, even if you had almost nothing to work with. Children would sit nearby, waiting for that first plate, watching the steam rise like a promise. The cook never hurried, stirring slow, letting the onions melt into the gravy until it smelled like comfort itself. It wasn't fancy, but it felt sacred, a meal built from patience, love, and trust in what you had. Smothered pork chops weren't just food, they were proof that love could season anything, and patience could feed a family when money could not.
Using coffee and gravy for depth separated ordinary cooks from grandmothers who understood flavor-building mysteries. After frying chicken or pork chops, Grandma deglazed her cast iron with leftover coffee from the morning pot, scraping up precious browned bits stuck to the bottom. The coffee added bitter, complexity-enhancing savory meat flavors without anyone identifying the secret ingredient. Mixed with flour and milk or broth, this became gravy tasting richer and more sophisticated than seemed possible from humble beginnings. Children begged for more, adults asked for the recipe, and Grandma smiled knowingly without revealing her trick. The coffee's roasted notes deepened the color and balanced sweetness, creating gravy worthy of Sunday dinner. Number 16, pouring the batter into hot fat for the sizzle ring. There is a sound a good cook waits for, and this trick is built around it. Before the batter ever went in, a spoonful of lard or bacon grease was dropped into the already screaming pan and swirled until it shimmered and nearly smoked. The grease had to be hot enough to ripple, almost ready to burn. When the batter hit that pool of fat, it sizzled around the rim and climbed the sides, frying the outer edge while the center baked. That gave the loaf a crisp, lacquered ring all the way around, the part everybody fought over at the table. The fat also greased the pan so the bread lifted out whole, never tearing or sticking to the iron. Skip this step and the batter just sat there, soaking instead of searing, and the edges came out soft and pale. The hot fat pour was the difference between plain cornbread and the kind people remembered. It cost almost nothing, just a spoon of grease and a little nerve to let the pan get that hot. Drop the fat in first and listen for the sizzle before you pour. Number 19, sun-drying fruit on tin roofs. This was summer's most important chore in the Black South, and nobody treated it lightly. In July and August, Black women in Georgia and the Carolinas sliced peaches, apples, and figs and laid them out on clean cloth atop tin roofs that baked in the summer sun. The heat and airflow removed moisture until the fruit turned leathery, like soft candy, and could be stored in cotton sacks through the coldest months. The process took 2 or 3 days, depending on the thickness of the slices. Women checked the fruit every few hours, turning the pieces to dry evenly and chasing off insects. Children were assigned to watch the trays and shoo away birds. It was a family operation with real consequences. If you did not dry enough fruit in July, your family had no fruit in January. That was not an inconvenience. That was a gap in the diet that nothing else could fill. The USDA advised against sun drying because it could not guarantee consistent temperatures or protection from contamination. They recommended electric dehydrators that cost more than some families earned in a month. But the tin roofs reached temperatures above 140 degrees on a July afternoon. That is the exact threshold the USDA now recommends for safe dehydration. The women were hitting the target without ever reading the manual. The tin roof was doing the same work as a $200 appliance, using nothing but sunlight. A church woman in Savannah dried enough peaches every summer to fill her pantry through Christmas. She gave bags of dried fruit as gifts the way other people gave cards. Neighbors came by in October asking if she had any peaches left. She always did. She had been doing it since the 1930s. Her peaches never made anyone sick, not once in 50 years. That tin roof was her dehydrator. The sun was free. The knowledge was what cost something. Number 17, saving the pot liquor for the next day's soup. The dark broth left in the bottom of the greens pot was never thrown out in Big Mama's kitchen. It was the foundation of tomorrow's supper. She would ladle the pot liquor into a clean glass jar, screw the lid down tight, and set it on the cold shelf of the icebox. The next afternoon, that same jar became the cooking liquid for a pot of rice, or the simmering base for a quick pan of dumplings, or the soup itself if the cornbread held out. The liquid carried every bit of flavor that had cooked out of the greens and the smoked meat, along with most of the water-soluble vitamins, which is why pot liquor was prescribed by Southern doctors during the Depression for anemic children. Big Mama saved it because the alternative was pouring grocery money down the drain, and she had never poured grocery money anywhere but into the pot. 1 pound of greens fed the family twice, and the second meal was usually the better one because the flavor had a night to settle and deepen. Number 19, storing food underground when there was no icebox in the house. Before electric refrigerators became common in black households across the rural South, grandmothers kept food cool the same way their own grandmothers had. They dug a root cellar, sometimes nothing more than a deep hole lined with boards and covered with a heavy lid, and they used the steady underground temperature to preserve what the kitchen could not. Sweet potatoes went down there by the bushel after the fall harvest, layered in straw so they would not touch and start to rot. Jars of pickled vegetables sat on low shelves in the dark. A crock of sauerkraut or chow chow could last for months in that cool air. Butter wrapped in a damp cloth stayed firm for days without melting. Some families used a spring house if they lived near running water, setting jars of milk and cream directly in the cold stream so the current kept the temperature down. Others hung a wire basket into the well shaft, lowering a jug of buttermilk until it dangled just above the water line where the air stayed cool year-round. None of this required a single purchase from a store. The ground itself was the refrigerator, and it cost nothing but the labor to dig it. A grandmother who kept a good root cellar could buy produce at its cheapest in late summer, store it properly, and feed her family through the winter without paying the inflated prices that came once the growing season ended. The savings were enormous. She was not just cooking, she was running a supply chain out of a hole in the yard, and it worked every single year. Stewed tomatoes spooned over plain white rice, made with whatever was in season or whatever was in the can. The tomatoes cooked down in a little fat with onion, salt, and black pepper until they lost their shape and became a thick, warm sauce. Poured over white rice, a small amount of flavor stretched across a large amount of food. In the rural South, this meal appeared when the week ran thin, cheap, fast, deeply filling, built from pantry staples that never ran out. The smell was sharp and sweet at once, the kind that settled into the walls of a kitchen. In the 1950s and 60s, as families moved north during the Great Migration, this meal traveled with them. Same tomatoes, same rice, same economy, and it showed up on Chicago and Detroit stovetops without missing a step. Number 26, hot link sandwiches on white bread. The hot link is a coarsely ground, heavily spiced beef and pork sausage with no equivalent in European charcuterie. Black fathers grilled them over direct heat until the casing split and the fat ran into the fire. The smoke that rose back up carried the flavor of every spice in the link. Served on 2 slices of white bread with raw onion and yellow mustard, it was the cheapest full meal at any cookout. A pack cost almost nothing. Every region had its own local maker, brand names handwritten on butcher paper, and none of them survived the consolidation of the American meat industry in the 1990s. And if the meat trick surprised you, wait until you hear what a splash of coffee did to a pot of beans. The pinto beans had been simmering since noon. She lifted the lid, tasted, and reached for the coffee pot. 3 or 4 ounces, poured in and stirred once, lid back down. Coffee added a roasted, slightly bitter undertone that amplified the earthiness of the beans in a way nothing else replicated. You couldn't identify it. You only knew this pot tasted different from every other pot. The distinction mattered in those kitchens. Watching was the only instruction you'd receive. She didn't call you over. She didn't explain. You either saw it or you missed it, and missing it meant your bean pot would always have something absent you couldn't name. This appears in old community cookbooks and in the margins of handwritten recipe cards, but it mostly lived in hands. Those hands are gone. The trick went with them, and the bean pots people make today are nourishing, but they're not the same. Stewed tomatoes could turn sharp and sour if you let them, especially the ones canned at the end of summer when the fruit came in fast and acidic. The fix was a pinch of sugar, sometimes 2, stirred in while the pot was still bubbling. It did not make the tomatoes sweet. It rounded them out, pulled back that bite that sat on the back of your tongue. This trick showed up in spaghetti sauce, ladled over white rice, in tomato gravy, spooned across biscuits, in the base of any stew where canned tomatoes formed the backbone. She never explained why it worked. She just tapped the sugar bowl with a teaspoon, let a little fall in, stirred once, and tasted. If you asked, she might say the tomatoes were angry and needed calming down. That was all the science you were going to get. No buttermilk meant a 10-second fix. You took whatever milk was left, poured a cup, added a tablespoon of white vinegar or lemon juice, stirred it twice, and let it sit for 5 minutes. What came back was close enough in chemistry to do the job. The acid had begun curdling the milk protein slightly, creating the tangy consistency that activates baking soda the way true buttermilk does. The acid-base reaction between buttermilk and baking soda is what produces the rise in quick breads. Carbon dioxide bubbles from chemistry, not just heat. African American bakers in the rural South, especially during the 1940s and 50s, when fresh buttermilk wasn't always available, knew this substitution by instinct. They didn't need a food chemistry textbook. They needed biscuits on the table by 6 in the morning, and the vinegar trick made that possible with whatever was left in the house.
Sweet potato pie was the dessert that anchored holidays and Sunday dinners. its warm spice and creamy filling as familiar as a favorite hymn. Grandma roasted the sweet potatoes until their natural sugars caramelized, then mashed them smooth with butter, sugar, and a careful blend of cinnamon, nutmeg, and vanilla. The scent of baking pie filled every corner of the house, pulling children from their games and adults from quiet conversations to peek into the oven. Its rich orange custard settled into a flaky crust that shattered delicately under a fork, releasing a steam that smelled like celebration itself. Served with whipped cream or simply on its own, each slice carried the sweetness of the harvest and the comfort of tradition. No holiday table felt complete without it, and no family gathering ended until every last crumb was gone. The pie told a story of African-American kitchens where resourcefulness met artistry, turning humble roots into a dish of elegance. Sweet potato pie remained a symbol of love and memory, proof that the simplest ingredients could create a flavor that lasted long after the plates were cleared and the evening grew quiet. Salmon croquettes were the breakfast of ingenuity, born from tin cans and imagination. Canned salmon was mixed with onions, cornmeal, and a bit of egg shaped into patties and fried until crisp. The smell filled the house like a promise that the day would be all right. They were crunchy on the outside, tender inside, and full of flavor that reached far beyond their humble ingredients. The sizzle of the skillet was music, the sound of a meal stretching to feed everyone. Eaten with grits, biscuits, or a little mustard on the side, they turned a simple morning into something memorable. These croquettes were survival disguised as comfort food, proof that scarcity never stopped creativity. They were hearty enough for men heading to work and tasty enough to make children smile. The golden crust caught the light just right, shining like victory in the pan. Salmon croquettes were a triumph of spirit and taste over circumstance.
Testing oil temperature with cornmeal was how Black grandmothers knew their skillets were ready without thermometers or gadgets. A pinch of cornmeal dropped into hot oil told the whole story. If it sank and sat lifeless, the oil needed more time. If it sizzled immediately, dancing across the surface and turning golden within seconds, the temperature was perfect for frying. Grandma read that sizzle like a language, knowing exactly when to add battered chicken or catfish. This technique prevented soggy, grease-soaked food from oil that wasn't hot enough and saved dinner from burning when oil got too aggressive. The cornmeal test required no batteries, just wisdom passed from mother to daughter across generations, and it worked every single time. Number 14, stirring a spoon of bacon drippings into the batter. The grease jar by the stove was not waste, it was seasoning, and a smart cook borrowed from it twice. Besides the fat that went in the pan, a spoonful of warm bacon drippings got stirred right into the batter itself. That carried the smoke and salt of the pork all the way through the bread. So every crumb tasted of the kitchen, not just the crust. It also kept the inside rich and moist, standing in for the butter and oil that money could not always buy. The drippings tin lived right beside the stove, filled a little more after every breakfast, and it was treasure in a poor kitchen. Nothing on that farm went to waste, and the grease saved from morning paid off again at supper. The fat coated the cornmeal, too, which kept the bread from drying out hard and crumbly the next day. A bread made this way needed no butter at all, though it surely got it anyway when there was some to spare. It is a small habit that turned a thin bread into a filling one. Spoon the warm drippings into the batter, and the whole loaf carries the flavor. Number 20, buttermilk soaking. Before you cook tough cuts of meat or wild game, you soak them in buttermilk overnight. Black women across the South knew this trick so deeply that it was never written down in any recipe. It lived in the hands, not on paper. The buttermilk tenderized the meat and extended its usable life by a full day or more. A tough piece of squirrel or rabbit that would have been like chewing rope came out of that buttermilk bath, soft enough to fall apart on the fork. Health departments said raw meat sitting in unrefrigerated buttermilk was a breeding ground for pathogens. They missed the point entirely. The lactic acid bacteria in buttermilk produce antimicrobial compounds, including bacteriocins and hydrogen peroxide. The pH drops low enough to inhibit harmful bacteria, while the enzymes break down tough connective tissue. Science now calls this biopreservation. Your grandmother called it getting the meat ready. Same process, different vocabulary. Number 19, sharpening the kitchen knife on the rim of a plate. The kitchen drawer in Big Mama's house did not contain a sharpening stone because the underside of every dinner plate she owned was already won. When the paring knife started to drag through a tomato instead of slicing it, she would flip an everyday ceramic plate upside down on the counter, find the unglazed ring around the rim where the plate had rested on the kiln, and draw the blade across that bare ceramic at a low angle, 10 or 12 strokes per side. The unglazed clay is harder than carbon steel, hard enough to grind a true edge back onto a dull blade in under a minute. Every black grandmother in the South seemed to know this without ever being told. Some learned it from their own mothers. Some figured it out the first time their best knife went soft. But the move was so common across kitchens that food historians now treat it as a signature of mid-century African-American home cooking. The plate did double duty, and the knife went right back to work. Number 23, growing greens from seeds saved year after year. Collard seeds cost nothing when they came from last season's plants. A grandmother would let 2 or 3 stalks go to flower at the end of summer, wait for the pods to dry on the stem, then strip them off, shake the seeds loose, and fold them into a paper envelope for the winter. Come spring, those seeds went straight into the dirt beside the house. No nursery, no seed catalog. Turnip greens, mustard greens, collards, all of it came from seeds that had been handed down from mother to daughter, sometimes across 3 generations. The same line of greens growing in the same patch of yard for 30 years. The grocery store never saw a dime of it. Number 20, dropping a clean copper penny into the greens pot to keep the color bright. A Sunday afternoon in Macon, Georgia, 1948. The collards had been picked from the garden that morning, the stems stripped, the leaves stacked and rolled and sliced into ribbons. Big Mama dropped them into the pot with a smoked turkey neck, a splash of cider vinegar, and a single Lincoln penny scrubbed bright with a slice of lemon. The greens cooked 2.5 hours. The copper held the green pigment in the leaves, so the pot came out emerald instead of army drab. She fished the penny out with a slotted spoon before serving and dropped it back into the cleaning jar by the sink. Modern cookbooks tell you to skip this trick because they're worried about leaching. Your Big Mama would tell you a clean penny in a clean pot for 2 hours never killed a soul, and the greens still tasted like Sunday. Adding vinegar to cooking greens was dismissed as peculiar taste preference, yet African American cooks insisted the splash of acid made vegetables more nutritious. Scientists now confirm that vinegar helps preserve vitamins during cooking, prevents color loss, and increases absorption of minerals like iron and calcium from leafy vegetables. Research shows that acidic environments protect certain nutrients from heat degradation while breaking down plant cell walls to release others. Grandmothers added their splash of apple cider or white vinegar toward the end of cooking, timing perfected through generations. The tang balanced the richness of smoked meat and cut through natural bitterness. What seemed like arbitrary seasoning was actually nutritional optimization that maximized what bodies could extract from every pot. Preheating low and slow was essential wisdom that separated experienced cooks from beginners in black kitchens of the 1950s. Grandmothers never rushed their cast iron, understanding that heavy pans needed time to heat evenly across their entire surface. A skillet placed over high flame developed hot spots that burned food in patches. Instead, the pan went over low heat for 15 minutes, the iron gradually absorbing warmth until every inch reached the same temperature. Only then would the flame increase. Children learned patience watching this process. The evenly heated surface meant chicken browned uniformly, cornbread developed consistent crust, and nothing stuck. This technique protected the seasoning too, preventing thermal shock that could damage the finish. The slow approach extended the pan's life across generations. The green tomatoes came off the vine when frost was close enough that waiting for them to ripen was no longer an option. Every garden had them, tomatoes that grew fat and firm but never turned red, and throwing them away was never considered. They got sliced thick, salted to draw out the water, then dredged in seasoned cornmeal and laid into hot grease. The cornmeal had to be coarse enough to hold and form a proper crust. Fine meal slid off and burned. The fat had to come halfway up each slice, and the heat had to be steady, too high, and the coating brown before the tomato softened beneath it. The finished slice was crisp outside and yielding in the middle, tangy and slightly bitter in a way ripe tomatoes never are. Most people who've eaten this have had a version, but not the version made from a tomato pulled an hour before it hit the skillet. That freshness changes everything. Number 28, charcoal roasted sweet potatoes buried in the ash. While the meat smoked above, the sweet potatoes cooked below. A father wrapped them in foil, or sometimes not at all, and pushed them straight into the hot coals at the base of the grill. They sat there for an hour, sometimes longer, until the skin turned to paper and the inside went soft enough to eat with a spoon. No butter, no brown sugar. The heat and the smoke did the work. The charcoal gave them a flavor no oven in any kitchen could replicate. This was the side dish nobody planned. It just happened because there was fire and there was sweet potatoes and a man who knew what to do with both. Cold sweet tea and the cornbread batter was the solution for mornings when the buttermilk was gone and the store was too far. Not freshly brewed, the leftover pitcher from yesterday, a little flat, a little darker than it started. It went into the batter in the same measure as buttermilk would have. The slight acidity in tea activated the baking soda the same way buttermilk did, giving the bread lift and a faint tang. Households across the rural South regularly substituted tea for buttermilk in quick breads during summer when heat spoiled dairy before it could be used. In African American families where sweet tea was brewed in gallon pitchers daily, particularly through the 1940s and 60s, there was almost always leftover tea before there was leftover buttermilk. The cornbread came out slightly darker in crust, denser in crumb, with a whisper of sweetness nobody could name. She'd smile and say she just had a good hand with the batter. The people who ate it believed her. The ones who watched closely knew better. A single smoked ham hock could flavor a pot big enough to feed 8 people for 2 days. That was the trick, born out of necessity so deep it became philosophy. Meat was expensive. Beans, rice, and greens were not. So the meat became a seasoning agent rather than the center of the plate, dropping its smoke and salt and fat into whatever surrounded it, while the cheaper ingredients did the heavy work. A piece of salt pork the size of a deck of cards could transform a bland pot of pinto beans into something rich and layered. A few strips of bacon rendered at the bottom of a Dutch oven became the base for cabbage that tasted like it had been cooking for a lifetime. Women who could not afford a roast every week still put meals on the table that tasted like abundance because they understood that flavor does not require volume. A little pork, a lot of patience, and a heavy lid could feed a household and leave everyone quiet and full. White sugar does one thing. Brown sugar does three. It sweetens, yes, but it also holds moisture. The molasses in brown sugar is hygroscopic, pulling water from the air and keeping baked goods softer longer. And it brings depth that refined white sugar cannot deliver. Something slightly caramel, the taste of the cane before all the complexity was processed away. African American bakers use brown sugar in sweet potato pies and cornbread and layer cakes long before the rest of American baking caught up. During the Depression and war years, when white sugar was rationed and tight, brown sugar was both cheaper and more available, and the baked goods from those kitchens were richer for it. Light brown sugar gives warmth. Dark brown gives depth close to molasses. The women who knew which to reach for never needed to explain why.
Cornbread skillet came to the table golden and fragrant, edges crisp from the heat of well-seasoned cast iron that never left Grandma's stove. She stirred cornmeal with flour, baking powder, milk, and a drizzle of bacon drippings, creating a batter that hissed when it touched the hot pan. The oven transformed it into a bread with a tender crumb and a crust that crackled under a knife, sending up a warm corn scent that made mouths water. Served with collard greens, black-eyed peas, or simply a pat of butter and a drizzle of sorghum syrup, it was the faithful companion to almost every meal. Its rustic simplicity spoke of fields and hard work, while its satisfying flavor turned even humble suppers into a feast. Every family had its own version, some sweet, some savory, but all carried the same spirit of nourishment and care. Cornbread skillet was more than side bread, it was the flavor of tradition, a daily reminder that the best dishes are often the simplest, passed from hand to hand and loved in every bite. Cornbread-topped chicken pot pie turned leftovers into gold. Instead of pastry crust, thrifty cooks poured cornbread batter over creamy chicken and vegetables, letting it bake until puffed and golden. The result was a perfect blend of soft filling and slightly sweet crust, hearty enough to stand alone. Every bite had the comfort of home, warm gravy, tender chicken, and buttery corn flavor melting together. The scent was pure nostalgia, that cozy mix of baked corn and simmered stock. This was a dish built on resilience, the kind that made the most of what was already there. It stretched a small bird across a family, leaving everyone full and grateful. Cornbread-topped chicken pot pie was food made with intention, proof that comfort didn't need excess. It needed heart. You could taste love in every layer, from the browned edges to the tender crumbs soaking up the sauce below.
Adding vinegar to pot liquor was Grandma's secret for greens that tasted brighter and more complex than anyone else's recipe. After collards or turnips simmered for hours with smoked meat, she added a splash of apple cider or white vinegar in the final minutes. This small addition cut through the richness of pork fat, balanced the mineral depth of the greens, and added subtle tang, making every bite more interesting. The vinegar also broke down tough fibers, ensuring greens were silky tender. That pot liquor, the precious broth left behind, became a tonic. Grandma insisted was good for colds and broken hearts alike. Families sopped it up with cornbread, drinking in vitamins and comfort. This simple trick elevated humble greens into something tasting like love. Number 13, never adding sugar. This was the rule they never broke, and it was almost a point of pride. Real Southern cornbread had no sugar in it. Not a spoonful, not a pinch. To these cooks, sugar turned bread into cake, and cake had no business sitting next to a pot of greens or a bowl of beans. Cornbread was meant to be a savory thing, a vessel for soaking up pot liquor and gravy, and sweetness only got in the way of that job. The corn itself carried all the gentle sweetness the bread ever needed, especially good stone ground meal that still had its oil. Sweet cornbread was sometimes called Yankee cornbread, said with a small frown, because the sugar marked it as somebody else's recipe from somewhere up north. There was also plain sense in the rule. Sugar was expensive and was saved for the cobblers and the cakes that earned the splurge on a special day. Wasting it on the everyday bread that came to the table 3 times a week made no sense in a careful kitchen. So the bread stayed honest, brown and deep and tasting of corn and fat and a little salt, exactly the way it was meant to taste beside greens and beans. A cook who slipped in sugar gave herself away. Leave the sugar in the bowl where it belongs. Number 18, ash lye hominy. This is the one that regulators tried hardest to stop. Black families in the Deep South soaked dried corn kernels in a solution of water and hardwood ash to make hominy. The lye from the ash dissolved the tough outer hull of the corn and transformed it into something softer, larger, and far more nutritious. The process is called the nixtamalization. Nobody in rural Alabama used that word. They called it making lye hominy. Public health officials banned the sale of homemade lye hominy in several states by the 1970s because lye is caustic and improperly prepared batches could cause chemical burns. The caution was not unreasonable, but the technique itself was brilliant. Nixtamalization releases niacin that is otherwise locked inside the corn. Without it, communities that depend on corn develop pellagra, a devastating deficiency disease. Indigenous peoples knew this thousands of years ago. Black families inherited the knowledge and kept it alive. Scientists did not fully explain the biochemistry until the late 20th century. The women who made lye hominy every fall were preventing a disease they had never heard of. When the government said stop, families who listened got sicker. Families who kept their ash hoppers in the backyard did not. Number 18, hand test in the hot pan with a flick of water. Big Mama did not set the burner and walk away. She tested the pan with her fingers and a drop of water. She would dip the tips of her fingers in the cold water glass next to the stove, shake them once over the dry iron, and watch what the droplets did. If the water vanished with a quiet hiss, the pan was still too cold and the cornbread batter would soak in and stick. If the water beaded up and skittered across the surface like little silver balls before evaporating, the pan was at the right temperature for searing, somewhere over 400 degrees. The drops danced because of what physicists later named the Leidenfrost effect, where the water forms a thin protective layer of steam that lets the bead float on its own vapor cushion. Big Mama had no name for it. She just knew that when the water danced, the pan was ready, and the first piece of meat would hit the iron with the right kind of sizzle. Wrong sizzle meant wrong supper. Number 18, thinning milk to make it stretch the full week. A gallon of milk was expensive relative to what a sharecropping family actually earned. So grandmothers stretched it. Half a glass of whole milk, half a glass of water, a tiny pinch of sugar stirred in. For cooking, the milk went even further. A splash in the cornbread batter, a careful pour in the gravy, a measured cup in the banana pudding. Nobody got a full glass to drink at the table. Nobody complained. The trick was distributing the nutrition across every single meal instead of letting anybody pour it all at once. 1 gallon could last a full week in a house with 5 or 6 children because it was never consumed straight. It was always stretched into something larger. Number 19, the cornmeal dredge, done twice with a 5-minute rest between coats. A Tuesday supper in 1961 Atlanta, the kitchen window opened to a thunderstorm rolling off Stone Mountain. Big Mama had 3 plates set out on the counter. The first held buttermilk, thick and tangy, a splash of hot sauce stirred in. The second held seasoned flour, salt, pepper, garlic powder, and a heavy pinch of paprika. The third held white cornmeal mixed with the same seasonings. She dipped each piece of catfish into the buttermilk, then rolled it through the flour, then back into the buttermilk a second time, then into the cornmeal. She set every dredged fillet on a wire rack over a plate and walked away for exactly 5 minutes. The first coat hydrated, the second coat dried into the first. By the time the lard hit 365 degrees in the iron skillet, the crust was already half locked on. She fried each fillet 2 minutes aside. The crust came out shattering crisp, golden as a Carolina sunset, sealed so tight that not a drop of oil reached the white flesh underneath. She learned the trick from a fish fry on the Pearl River when she was 11 years old. The man running the fryer was an oysterman from Biloxi who'd been frying mullet for 40 years. He told her the rest is the recipe. The buttermilk and the meal are just paint. The rest is what holds the picture together. The part few people talk about is that Big Mama passed it on to her 3 daughters and 7 granddaughters, one by one, every Friday night. One of them is still doing it in a kitchen in Charlotte, and her grandchildren can't eat fast food fish without saying it tastes like soggy cardboard. The trick is older than the supermarket. It's older than the deep fryer. It's as old as a black grandmother who refused to serve her family anything less than glass. Cooking with smoked meat for seasoning was criticized as adding unnecessary fat to healthy vegetables. Yet African American cooks understood something deeper about nutrition. Scientists now recognize that smoke contains compounds with antimicrobial properties while adding complex flavors impossible to replicate artificially. Research confirms that small amounts of smoked pork provide essential amino acids that transform plant-based meals into complete proteins. Ham hocks, bacon ends, and smoked turkey necks added collagen that promoted gut health. Grandmothers knew exactly how much meat was needed to season an entire pot of beans or greens, stretching precious protein while maximizing flavor. What dietitians once condemned, nutrition science, now acknowledges as intuitive understanding of how flavor and nutrition work together. Flour dredging in paper bags was the mess-free technique Black grandmothers perfected for coating chicken, fish, and pork chops. Seasoned flour went into a large brown paper bag along with pieces of meat. The bag was folded closed, then shaken vigorously until every piece wore an even coat. Children often helped with the shaking, turning kitchen work into something playful. The paper absorbed excess moisture while distributing flour evenly without creating countertop disaster. When finished, the bag went straight into trash, leaving nothing to wash. The technique worked because confined space and agitation coated every surface. Some grandmothers added secret spice blends to the flour, creating proprietary mixtures that defined their signature fried foods. The paper bag method was practical genius that delivered perfectly coated results. Number 12, resting the batter so the meal drinks the liquid. Patience showed up again here in a step most modern cooks skip. After the batter was mixed, a good cook let it sit a few minutes while the pan came up to heat. That rest gave the coarse cornmeal time to drink in the buttermilk and soften instead of staying gritty and dry in the middle of the bread. The grains swelled and the batter thickened, which made for a crumb that held together tender rather than crumbling apart on the plate. With stone ground meal especially, that soaking time mattered, since the rough grind needed a minute to relax and take on the liquid. The weight also let the leavening get going, so the batter went in already lively. Cooks judged it by feel, knowing the batter was ready when it had thickened just enough to mound softly on a spoon. Rushing the bowl into a cold pan undid all of it, leaving a gritty, fallen bread. 2 old steps, a screaming pan, and a rested batter worked hand in hand toward the same loaf. Let the meal sit and drink before it ever seized the iron. Number 17, burying vegetables in sand. Sweet potatoes, turnips, and beets were layered in wooden crates with damp sand between each row, then stored in a root cellar or buried in a pit dug into the earth. The sand held just enough moisture to prevent shriveling, but not enough to encourage rot. It worked like a thermostat made of earth. Your family could pull fresh vegetables from that crate in February that had been buried since October. They tasted almost as fresh as the day they went into the ground. County agents called it unsanitary because soil contact could introduce bacteria. But the sand was not soil. It was a humidity control system, as precise in its own way as a walk-in cooler. Modern cold storage facilities use the same principle, controlled humidity between 85 and 95% at temperatures just above freezing. A hole in the ground in Georgia maintained roughly those conditions from November through March without a single kilowatt of electricity. Number 16, rescuing scorched milk with cold tap water and a clean pan. A pot of milk that turned its back on you for 30 seconds could fill the whole house with a burnt smell that lingered for days. Big Mama did not throw it out. She lifted the scorched pot off the heat, set it straight into a sink of cold tap water without stirring, and waited 2 full minutes. The cold shock kept the burnt layer welded to the bottom of the pot instead of mixing up into the rest of the milk. Then she gently poured the still good milk off the top into a fresh, clean pan and finished cooking it without a hint of scorch. The trick saved gravy, it saved oatmeal, it saved more pots of grits than any son or daughter cared to count, and the burnt pot soaked overnight in baking soda water came clean by morning. Number 17, making one chicken feed the family 3 separate meals. The first meal was the roasted bird itself, served on a Sunday after church with rice and gravy. Whatever meat was left on the bones after dinner went into a pot of water with onion ends, a few peppercorns, and whatever celery tops or carrot stubs were in the icebox. That became stock, and the stock became Monday's soup. By Tuesday, the last scraps of meat picked off the carcass were folded into rice or stirred into a thick gravy and served over biscuits. 3 full meals from one animal. The bones went into the garden as fertilizer. The fat was skimmed off the soup and saved for the grease jar. A single chicken, bought at the right price or raised in the backyard, could carry a family nearly halfway through the week if the woman cooking knew how to think 3 meals ahead. Using molasses instead of white sugar was considered old-fashioned and unsophisticated, a mark of poverty rather than deliberate choice. Scientists now recognize that blackstrap molasses contains significant iron, calcium, magnesium, and potassium that refine white sugar strips away during processing. Research confirms that molasses provides antioxidants supporting bone health, blood sugar regulation, and cardiovascular function. African American cooks stirred it into coffee, drizzled it over biscuits, and baked it into gingerbread that satisfied sweet cravings while delivering actual nutrition. Grandmothers kept sticky jars in pantries, using molasses when money was tight, unknowingly choosing the healthier option. What was dismissed as poverty cooking turns out to be nutritional wisdom modern health advocates now recommend. The splatter shield with pot lids was practical protection Black grandmothers used against hot grease burns while monitoring their frying food. Oh, a lid held at an angle over the skillet deflected spitting oil away from hands and arms while allowing steam to escape and letting cooks watch browning progress. This technique required skill. Holding the lid too close trapped steam and made food soggy, while holding it too far offered little protection. Grandmothers developed steady hands from years of practice, able to flip chicken one-handed while the other held the shield. Children were warned repeatedly about grease burns and taught this defensive technique before being allowed near the stove. The pot lid method also caught grease vapor, keeping kitchen walls cleaner. Every kitchen already had one. Dirty rice earned its name from the color. Chicken livers and gizzards cooked down and folded into white rice turned the whole pot a speckled, deep brown that looked rough but tasted like one of the finest things a Louisiana kitchen ever made. The dish traced directly to Creole cooking traditions among Black families in the Bayou parishes, where the cheapest parts of the chicken, the organs, the necks, the backs, carried more flavor than the breasts and cost a fraction of the price. The livers went in first, cooked hard in oil with onion, celery, and bell pepper until dark and caramelized, then mixed through cooked white rice and seasoned with black pepper, cayenne, and thyme. The result was cheap to make, dense with iron and protein, and so deeply flavored it could hold a holiday table beside anything more expensive. People who grew up eating dirty rice understand that the organ meats are not a compromise. They are the point. Those parts carry the depth. Everything else is background. Number 25, barbecued chicken gizzards on a skewer. Gizzards are tough, dense muscle, and most cooks threw them away with the giblet bag. Black fathers soaked them in buttermilk, seasoned them heavy, threaded them onto metal skewers, and grilled them slow over low coals until they went tender inside and charred outside. The texture was nothing like regular chicken. It was closer to a chew than a bite. Children either loved them or refused to touch them. There was no middle ground. A pound cost less than a single chicken breast, and a father could feed a table of 8 from that 1 pound. The gizzard skewer disappeared when supermarkets stopped selling gizzards by the bag and started grinding them into pet food. Coffee grounds went into the garden the same way everything else did, by the rule that nothing useful left this house without being fully spent. Scraped from the morning pot directly into the vegetable patch, worked into the soil around the tomatoes and collards with the toe of a shoe. By the mid-1800s, agricultural publications already documented that spent grounds contained measurable nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, 3 primary nutrients plants need for growth. In Black family gardens throughout the rural South, where commercial fertilizer was expensive and scarce, coffee grounds cycled into the earth as a matter of course. She didn't think of it as science. She thought of it as not throwing away something that still had work to do. Those gardens, dense, productive, year after year, without store-bought amendments, were a form of knowledge that slipped away when the houses were sold. The liquid left behind after greens simmered for hours was never poured down the drain. That broth, dark and heavy with everything the collars had released, was called pot liquor, and it was treated like medicine. When someone was sick, they got a warm cup of it with cornbread to soak. When the next meal needed a base, pot liquor replaced water in soups, gravies, and rice. It carried iron, calcium, and vitamins that had cooked out of the leaves. Though nobody was reading a nutrition label, they just knew it made people stronger and food taste deeper. Churches served it at repasts after funerals, quietly in small cups alongside the main spread, because grief and hunger arrived together and pot liquor answered both. Wasting it would have been like throwing away the best part of the meal. The women who saved every drop understood something modern kitchens have nearly abandoned. Nothing good gets discarded. Between the 1920s and 1940s, the Southern kitchen slowly divided over pie crust, and the fault line was fat. One side stayed with lard, rendered from pork, used in African American kitchens for generations, its larger fat crystals creating distinct steam pockets that produce a shatteringly flaky texture no other fat can fully replicate. The other side switched to Crisco, marketed since 1911 as cleaner and more wholesome than animal fat. Many black households made the switch, but the ones who kept their leaf lard cold and kept rolling that dough the same way their mothers had, their crusts were different. A slight savory undertone balanced a sweet filling in a way that only lard achieves, and the texture shattered into clean fragments rather than bending. Food scientists eventually confirmed what those bakers already knew: leaf lard, rendered from fat around the pig's kidneys, produces the most tender pastry of any known shortening. The grandmothers knew that 50 years before anyone ran a lab test. Some of them are gone now, and the lard tins went with them.
Fried catfish brought a sense of celebration to Friday nights and Saturday gatherings, a dish that promised crisp golden fillets with each sizzle of hot oil. Grandma coated fresh cleaned fish in seasoned cornmeal, the grains clinging lightly to the flesh before it slipped into the bubbling pan. The kitchen filled with the sound of crackling and the aroma of spice, drawing family and neighbors alike toward the stove. When the catfish emerged perfectly browned and flaky inside, it was laid on paper to drain and then served with lemon wedges, tartar sauce, or a simple sprinkle of salt. Children loved the crunchy crust, while elders savored the sweet, tender meat that spoke of rivers and fishing trips long past. Fried catfish joined coleslaw, cornbread, and tall glasses of sweet tea on the table, turning an ordinary evening into a shared feast. It honored the tradition of using local catch and patient frying skill, reminding everyone that celebration could be found in the bounty of nearby waters and the laughter of a crowded kitchen. Turnip green pot pie was a dish that blended creativity with thrift, transforming greens into the centerpiece of a meal. My grandmother cooked the greens down with onion and broth until tender, then poured them into a dish and covered them with pie crust or biscuit dough. As it baked, the crust turned golden and flaky, soaking in the juices of the greens below. It looked like a Sunday supper, even though it was made from humble garden vegetables. Families sliced into the pot pie and found warmth, substance, and a reminder that greens were not just a side dish, but a main course. Paired with cornbread or beans, it became a meal that stretched across households. In the 1960s, this kind of resourcefulness kept families going, proving that with care and imagination, even simple greens could feel special. Turnip green pot pie was proof that hard times did not mean giving up pride at the table.
Reviving stale bread with water and heat was how black grandmothers refused to let anything go to waste in their kitchens. When a loaf had gone past its prime, dry and crumbly where it once was soft, Grandma ran it quickly under the faucet, getting the crust damp but not soaked through. She placed the moistened loaf directly in a hot oven for just a few minutes, watching carefully. Steam regenerated inside the bread, rehydrating starches that had gone hard and crusty. The result was bread tasting nearly fresh, with crisp crust and soft interior that seemed impossible given its previous state. This trick saved money and prevented waste, values Grandma held sacred after surviving times when food was never guaranteed. The revived bread made perfect toast or bread pudding. Number 11, folding pork cracklings into crackling bread. When there was pork to spare, plain cornbread got a glorious upgrade. After lard was rendered down, the crisp little bits of fried fat and skin left behind were called cracklings, and a cook folded a generous handful of them right into the batter. They baked up into crunchy, salty, smoky nuggets all through the bread, turning a humble loaf into something close to a feast. Crackling bread has a long and heavy history behind it. It was eaten in the cabins of enslaved people, made from the scraps and renderings left after the better cuts of the hog were taken away to the big house, and black cooks learned to coax real richness out of even those leftovers. The cracklings themselves came from the hog killing, when the men rendered the fat down in a great black wash pot, and the crisp bits left behind were divided among everyone who helped with the day's hard work. Out of that hardship came a bread so good it outlived the cruelty that shaped it, and it still shows up proudly at our Southern tables today, in cookbooks and at church suppers alike. Nothing on a hog was ever wasted, not the fat, not the skin, not a scrap, and crackling bread proved it better than anything. The crunch of pork worked through warm cornbread was a small, hard-earned luxury pulled from what others threw out. Save your cracklings and fold them in for the richest bread of all. Number 15, salt brine, fish preservation. Along the rivers and coastlines of the South, Black families caught more fish than they could eat in a single day. Catfish, bream, crappie, whatever the river offered. But without refrigeration, fish spoiled faster than almost any other food. So the surplus went into a crock of heavily salted water, packed tight with enough salt to make the brine feel thick on your fingers. The brine penetrated the flesh and dropped the water activity to a level where spoilage organisms could not survive. When your family needed protein, you pulled a piece from the brine, soaked it in fresh water to draw out the excess salt, and cooked it as if it had come straight from the river. Fried saltfish with grits and onions was a breakfast that fed families along the Carolina coast for generations. Regulators said home brining was inconsistent and risky. Modern food scientists confirmed that salt concentrations above 10% effectively halt bacterial growth. The women who packed fish in crocks every summer did not measure water activity. They tasted the brine. If it was salty enough to pucker your lips, it was salty enough to keep the fish safe. The tongue was their instrument. Number 15, crisping a meat top with bread heat in a covered pan. Without a working broiler, Big Mama still got a golden crust on every chop and chicken thigh that left her stove. The move was simple and almost forgotten now. After the meat had cooked through in the heavy pan, she would lay a few thick slices of day-old bread directly on top of the meat, clamp the lid down tight, and turn the burner up high for 1 full minute. The dry bread soaked up the rising steam. The trapped heat had nowhere to escape but back down into the meat, and the top of the chop browned and crisped as if it had been under a broiler. She would lift the lid, peel the bread off, and serve the meat with the crisp bread crumble over the top like a free seasoning. Nothing wasted, nothing extra bought, just heat used twice. Number 16, canning everything the garden produced in summer so the family could eat in winter. August was not a month of rest. It was a month of boiling jars, green beans, whole tomatoes, sliced peaches, pear preserves, chow chow, pickled beets, pepper relish. If it grew in the garden or came cheap from a neighbor's tree, it went into a mason jar, got sealed with a hot lid, and went onto the pantry shelf. By October, that shelf looked like a wall of glass, and that wall was winter. A grandmother with a full canning shelf did not need the grocery store from November through March. She opened a jar of tomatoes in January and served them like they had just come off the vine. The work was brutal, standing over a pot of boiling water in the August heat for days at a time, but the payoff lasted 6 months. Number 18, finishing the gravy with a tablespoon of cold butter swirled in off the heat. A Thanksgiving morning in 1957, Charlotte, the roasting pan held 2 cups of dark drippings and a slurry of flour and water whisked smooth. Big Mama brought it to a simmer, scraped every brown bit off the bottom, and turned the burner off. Then she dropped a cold pat of butter, half the size of a matchbox, into the center of the gravy and swirled the pan in a slow circle. The butter melted as it moved. The fat coated the starch molecules. The gravy turned glossy and thick, the kind of finish a French chef would call mounted with butter and charge you $80 for at a hotel. Big Mama called it the last shine. She did the same thing to the pot liquor, the red-eye gravy, and the pan sauce. The trick cost 3 cents and made every plate look like the cover of a magazine. Letting batter rest before frying was a step many modern cooks skip. Yet, African-American grandmothers insisted the weight made all the difference in crunch and texture. Food scientists now confirm that resting allows gluten strands to relax, starches to hydrate fully, and air bubbles to stabilize, creating lighter, crispier coatings. Research shows rested batters absorb less oil during frying because their structure is more cohesive. Grandmothers would mix their cornmeal coating, then attend to other kitchen tasks while the mixture transformed. The resulting fried chicken and catfish emerged with crust that shattered between teeth rather than turning soggy. What seemed like patience forced by busy kitchens was deliberate technique that improved texture and reduced oil absorption. Skillet cornbread crust technique created that distinctive crispy bottom that made cast iron cornbread legendary in Black kitchens. The secret began with heating the empty skillet in a hot oven until it practically glowed, then adding generous bacon grease that immediately smoked. Batter went in next, hitting that screaming hot surface with a dramatic sizzle. Contact with intensely heated fat created an instant crust on the bottom while the top remained soft. As cornbread baked, that bottom crust turned deep golden brown, almost caramelized, with a crunch that shattered against teeth. The technique required confidence. Hesitation meant uneven crust or batter that stuck. Grandmothers moved quickly, having performed this ritual countless times. Children learned by watching, understanding the sizzle meant everything was working. Dried beans were never the backup plan. They were the plan. Through the 1940s and 50s, a pound of navy beans or pintos could feed a large family for pennies and sit in the pantry through any emergency. The fatback went in with the soaked beans, not as something to eat, but as a seasoning, a thick slab of salt-cured pork fat that dissolved slowly into the broth over hours, releasing a smoky richness that made the beans taste far more complex than beans and water alone. In many Black Southern households, this pot went on the stove early in the morning and didn't come off until supper. You stirred it when you passed. You added water when the level dropped. No timers, no thermometers, just attention and rhythm that could happen while other work was being done. The beans swelled and softened until the broth thickened naturally around them. The fatback gave body to every spoonful, and the beans gave protein and starch enough to quiet any hunger at the table. Built from almost nothing, it tasted like everything. Number 23, grilled deer sausage. Rural Mississippi, Alabama, and East Texas shared a calendar where hunting season and cookout season overlapped. A father who hunted brought home venison, ground it with pork fat and red pepper flake, stuffed it into natural casings, and froze it in coils for the summer. That sausage showed up at every 4th of July and Labor Day gathering. It was leaner, spicier, and carried a wild gaminess that divided the table. The ones who grew up on it could never eat commercial sausage the same way again. Deer sausage required a hunter, a meat grinder, natural casings, and more time than most men were willing to give. When those fathers stopped going into the woods, the sausage stopped showing up at the table. Spent tea bags didn't go in the trash after the pot was poured. They went on the eyelids or pressed against the burn from the stove or lay cool and damp on a child's swollen insect sting. The tannic acid in black tea constricts blood vessels and reduces inflammation when applied to skin, a property documented in medical literature going back to the 19th century. In kitchens where a tube of cream cost money nobody had, this was the first response. The bag had to be cooled but not cold, body temperature, set on the counter just long enough to be bearable against skin. She'd hold it against the burn for 60 seconds and tell you not to squirm. The swelling went down. You didn't always believe it was the tea. She didn't need you to believe it. She just needed it to work. In households running 2 or 3 tea bags through a full day's worth of steeping, there were always enough used bags on the counter for whatever the kitchen sent at you next. The tea bag as household remedy is mostly gone now, replaced by products that cost 10 times as much and work about as well. It sounds like superstition, and maybe part of it was, but the copper penny dropped into a pot of collard greens showed up in kitchens from rural Georgia to the south side of Chicago. The idea was simple. Copper helped the greens hold their color during the long, slow cook, keeping them from turning that dull olive brown that made even the best pot look tired. Old pennies, the ones minted before 1982 when they were still 95% copper, worked best. Some women used a clean copper nail instead. The chemistry involved copper ions interacting with chlorophyll, stabilizing the green pigment against the acid released during cooking. But that explanation came decades later from food scientists who had finally caught up to what these women already knew. The penny came out before serving, rinsed and dropped back into the junk drawer until the next pot. It was a small trick, nearly invisible, but the greens that emerged were as vivid as the day they were picked. The difference between a good custard pie and a great one often came down to a single small can. Evaporated milk from the shelf with the 2 punched holes in the top was not a shortcut in African American kitchens. It was a deliberate choice. Regular milk carries too much water, and in a custard filling, that excess dilutes the proteins that need to set the pie firm. The result weeps liquid into the crust and won't slice clean. Evaporated milk has had roughly 60% of its water removed, concentrating the proteins and milk sugars until it's nearly twice as rich. African American bakers adopted it in custard pies, sweet potato, chess, buttermilk, coconut, from at least the 1930s onward, when canned goods became staples in rural Southern households that couldn't count on fresh dairy every week. The silkier texture, the clean edge when cut, none of that came from talent alone. It came from knowing what was in the can and exactly why it worked better than what came out of the bottle.
Pecan pie offered a slice of sweet Southern indulgence that shone like amber in the light, its glossy filling studded with crunchy toasted nuts. Grandma blended sugar, eggs, and dark syrup into a smooth mixture before folding in fresh pecans harvested from local trees or market stalls. Baked until the filling set into a soft caramel and the nuts formed a fragrant crust, the pie emerged rich enough to satisfy the biggest sweet tooth. Served with whipped cream or a simple pour of coffee, it ended Sunday dinners and holiday feasts with a touch of elegance. The pecan pie reflected generations of African American cooks who elevated humble ingredients into timeless desserts, combining resourcefulness with artistry. Each slice carried the warmth of family gatherings and the shared stories told after plates were cleared. The sweetness was never only sugar. It was memory, tradition, and the pride of turning nature's gifts into celebration. Pecan pie remained a centerpiece on Grandma's table, a dessert that whispered of Southern forests and the enduring creativity of the cooks who came before. Caramel cake was once the centerpiece of Sunday dinners, a dessert that showed love, patience, and skill in every slice. The cake itself was soft and tender, but it was the icing that made it unforgettable. Homemade caramel frosting required time and attention, stirring sugar and butter until it transformed into a golden, rich glaze. African American families across the South often saved caramel cake for special occasions where it graced the table as a symbol of celebration. It was not a quick dessert, but one that demanded practice, steady hands, and a willingness to stand over the stove until the caramel reached perfection. The flavor was sweet, with a depth that no boxed mix could imitate, and the texture melted on the tongue with every bite. Children often begged for the first slice, and grandmothers proudly served it to guests as proof of their kitchen mastery. Over time, easier frostings and store-bought cakes took its place, but the memory of caramel cake still lingers for those who grew up with it. It was more than just dessert, it was a statement of love baked into every layer.
Crisping chicken skin with baking powder was Grandma's answer to achieving shatteringly crisp fried chicken without a deep fryer. She patted chicken pieces completely dry, then dusted them lightly with baking powder mixed into seasoned flour before frying. The baking powder raised the pH of the skin, helping it brown faster and develop tiny bubbles, creating extra crunch. This technique meant skin stayed crispy even after sitting during a long family meal, never turning soggy. Grandma's chicken crackled when you bit into it, giving way to juicy meat beneath that golden armor. She learned this from her own mother, who discovered it through trial and error in a kitchen without modern conveniences. It remains a simple addition, making an enormous difference. Number 10, shaping corn pone by hand with just meal, water, and salt. When the larder was nearly bare, this was the bread that still got made. There was no buttermilk, no egg, no leavening, only stone ground meal, a little salt, and enough hot water to bring it together into a stiff dough. A cook scooped up a handful, patted it into a small oval right in her palm, and pressed her fingerprints into the top before it ever met the heat. That hand shaping is where the name comes from, since pone traces back to an Indian word the native peoples of the Southeast use for their baked corn cakes. The word can be traced to the Powhatan term appan, meaning something baked, recorded by English colonists in Virginia as early as 1612, when they ate the bread the Powhatan people called ponap. The dough went into a greased pan or straight onto the hot hearth, and it baked up dense, chewy, and honest, made to be broken apart and dipped in pot liquor. Pone fed enslaved families and poor farmers alike because it asked for almost nothing and filled a working body all morning. It is the oldest cornbread there is, the recipe stripped down to corn and fire. When the cupboard was empty, hands and meal and water was still enough. Number 16, cane syrup preserving. In the sugarcane belt of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, Black families poured thick cane syrup over fruits and sometimes meats to preserve them. The syrup's sugar concentration was so high that it pulled water out of any bacteria that landed on the surface, killing them through osmotic pressure. The same principle makes honey one of the only foods that never spoils. Nutritionists in the 20th century dismissed syrup preservation as nothing more than candy making and warned it was too high in sugar to be considered a legitimate food safety practice. But osmotic preservation is now a recognized method in food science. The sugar concentration in cane syrup exceeds 60%, which is well above the threshold needed to prevent microbial growth. Those families were practicing the same science that keeps your store-bought jam safe on the shelf for years. The jar was different, the chemistry was identical. Number 14, saving cake batter from curdling with a warm bowl. The coldest months of winter were the hardest on a pound cake because cold butter and cold eggs refused to come together into smooth batter. Big Mama solved the problem with a kettle of warm water and a metal mixing bowl. She would fill the kettle, pour the warm water into the bottom of the sink, and sit the empty metal bowl in the water for 2 or 3 minutes before she began creaming the butter and sugar. The bowl came out warm to the touch, just shy of body temperature, which was enough to keep the butter soft as she worked. When the eggs went in one at a time, they did not seize the butter into a curdled mess. The batter stayed silky from start to finish, and the cake came out of the oven with the close, tender crumb that made her pound cakes famous at every funeral, wedding, and Sunday dinner from October through March. Cold kitchen, warm bowl, smooth batter, 3 steps, 1 rule. Number 15, foraging wild greens from ditches, fields, and creek banks. Poke salad, dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, watercress, growing where the creek ran shallow over rocks. These were not weeds to a Depression-era grandmother. They were free food growing in places nobody else thought to look. The trick was knowing which ones to pick, when to pick them young, and how to cook them safe. Poke salad had to be boiled and drained at least twice to draw the bitterness and toxins out. Dandelion leaves were best before the plant flowered, while they were still tender. This was knowledge that came from generations of women who understood the land around them, and it did not cost a single cent at any store. Number 15, brining the chicken in salted water with a bay leaf for 4 hours before frying. A Friday afternoon in 1963 Jackson, Mississippi. Big Mama mixed a 1/4 cup of kosher salt into a 1/2 gallon of cold water, dropped 2 bay leaves into the brine, and submerged a cut-up chicken in the bowl. She covered it and left it on the cool tile floor of the pantry for 4 hours. The salt traveled into every fiber of meat. The water locked itself in. By the time she dredged the chicken through her seasoned flour, the meat was already 1/3 of the way to perfect. She fried it in lard at 350 degrees for 14 minutes. The skin came out the color of a Carolina pine cone. The white meat was juicy enough to leave a slick on the plate. Her grandchildren would tell you nobody since has ever made fried chicken that good. Double frying for extra crispiness was considered wasteful by those who did not understand the science happening in that hot oil. African American cooks knew that frying chicken twice produced a crust that stayed crispy for hours, perfect for church picnics where food sat on tables through long afternoons. Scientists now confirm that the first fry cooks the interior and sets the coating, while the second fry at higher temperature creates a shatteringly crisp exterior with less oil absorption. The technique drives out moisture that would otherwise make coatings soggy. Grandmothers learned through trial what food engineers now study in laboratories. That extra step transformed ordinary fried chicken into legendary fried chicken. What seemed like unnecessary effort was precise technique that single frying simply cannot match. The resting period after frying was crucial knowledge Black grandmothers understood instinctively. Fried foods pulled straight from hot grease were good, but those allowed to rest on wire racks for several minutes reached another level. During this pause, the crust continued to crisp as residual heat escaped while juices redistributed evenly through the meat. Cutting into chicken too soon released precious moisture that should have stayed locked within. The resting period also allowed excess grease to drip away, making each bite cleaner and crunchier. Children learned patience watching their grandmothers hold back the family from grabbing pieces too quickly. That waiting time transformed good fried food into perfect fried food. The technique required self-control, but rewarded patience handsomely. The skillet corn pudding sat somewhere between cornbread and a custard, denser than either, sweeter than what you ate with beans, richer than the foil pan version at potlucks. It was cast iron food, a well-seasoned skillet heated in the oven until the fat shimmered, then batter poured over that heat so a crust formed from the bottom up before the top ever set. In season, kernels went in fresh, cut from the cob, and the cob scraped clean to release the milky liquid that made the pudding silky. The dish carried roots in both West African cooking traditions and Native American corn preparations that had exchanged hands across the Deep South over generations. At church suppers, Through the 1950s, it sat in the center of the spread without explaining itself. You either knew what you were tasting the moment it hit your mouth, or you didn't. Number 22, barbecued lamb ribs. Before the price of lamb climbed beyond reason, Black fathers in the Mid-South and parts of Tennessee treated lamb ribs the same way they treated pork. The ribs were smaller, thinner, and cooked faster, with a sharp mineral taste that pork could not match. Seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and garlic powder, grilled hot until the thin layer of fat crisped and the bone ends went black. They were eaten by hand, standing over the grill, one thin rib at a time, the grease running down to the wrist. Lamb ribs today cost more per pound than a ribeye steak in most markets. The cookout lamb rib was not killed by taste, it was killed by price. Here is something worth saying out loud. The men who ran these grills were not chefs. They were truck drivers, deacons, mechanics, factory line workers. They never opened a cookbook. They never measured a single ingredient. They learned by standing next to their own fathers, watching how the smoke moved, learning when to flip by the sound the fat made when it hit the coals. That knowledge traveled across generations and produced food that rivaled anything coming out of competition circuits and restaurant kitchens. But none of it was recorded. None of it was photographed. When those men died, the recipes died with them. The split drums went cold. The cinder block pits got hauled off. And a whole industry stepped in with vacuum-sealed ribs and bottled rubs and store-bought sauce and acted like it had invented something. Collard greens that had dried out in the refrigerator, or mustard greens cut a day too long, had a toughness that extra cooking couldn't fix. The solution was a soak in strong brewed black tea before the greens went into the pot. Cold tea, enough to cover the leaves for 20 to 30 minutes. The tannins in black tea soften the cell walls of leafy greens by drawing out excess mineral salts that cause stiffness, loosely parallel to how tannins tenderize meat protein. The greens came out darker and more pliable, and they took to the pot liquor faster once they hit the cast iron. This was not a trick anyone announced. If the greens were on the stove, someone had already done the work before you arrived. You saw the bowl. You didn't comment. You filed it away. In those kitchens, knowledge passed through watching. The moment you had to ask, you'd already missed the lesson. Adding a splash of vinegar to pie crust dough was the kind of trick that never made it into any cookbook your family owned, because the women who made the best pies never consulted one. A tablespoon of apple cider vinegar stirred into the ice water before it hit the flour kept the gluten from developing too far, producing a crust so flaky it shattered at the touch of a fork. The acid worked against the proteins that wanted to bind together and turn the dough tough, and the result was a pastry that held its shape in the oven but came apart on the tongue like it was barely holding itself together. Sweet potato pie, buttermilk pie, vinegar pie itself, they all started with this same quiet trick. She mixed the dough fast, handled it as little as possible, and never rolled it more than once. The secret was not in the filling, it was in what nobody saw, the invisible chemistry happening inside the crust before the pie ever reached the oven. The biscuits demanded improvisation, and the tool was already on the table. In nearly every African-American kitchen from the 1930s through the 1960s, there was a wide, heavy drinking glass with a second job nobody discussed. It just was the biscuit cutter, used so long that a faint ring of flour had worn into the rim. You press straight down, never twisted. Twisting seals the cut edges and prevents the layers from rising, and the glass left a clean circle that baked into exactly the size that kitchen had always made. The no twist rule is technical. A clean edge lets steam escape straight up through the open layers, creating the visible separation you can pull apart with your hands. The glass had the right rim. The woman pressing it knew the physics, even if she never used that word. And if the biscuit work took patience, it was nothing.
Hoppin' John carried the deep roots of Gullah Geechee heritage, a simple yet profound combination of rice and black-eyed peas seasoned with onions, bacon, and a hint of spice. Grandma rinsed the peas carefully, then simmered them with smoky bacon until the broth turned rich and savory. Fluffy rice was folded in just before serving, allowing every grain to absorb the flavorful liquid. The dish arrived on New Year's Day to invite luck and prosperity, but appeared throughout the year because its taste and meaning were too good to reserve for one occasion. Families gathered to share heaping bowls, pairing it with collard greens and cornbread to complete a meal that honored ancestors and celebrated community. Each bite told the story of African traditions carried to the Low Country and kept alive through generations of careful cooking and storytelling. Hoppin' John was both everyday comfort and sacred ritual, a warm reminder that food is culture and memory woven together, keeping history alive in kitchens filled with love and steadfast pride. Cornbread and beans was the supper of survivors, the backbone of countless working families who knew how to turn little into plenty. The beans simmered low and slow, soaking up every bit of flavor from scraps of onion, bacon, or a precious ham bone saved from Sunday dinner. The longer they cooked, the richer they became, filling the home with a deep, savory scent that promised satisfaction. Cornbread baked nearby, its golden crust rising in the oven, the smell of butter and cornmeal mixing perfectly with the aroma of beans on the stove. When dinner was ready, families gathered close, crumbling the cornbread right into their bowls to soak up the thick broth. It wasn't just filling, it was fulfilling, warming both the body and the spirit. Some families added vinegar, others sprinkled sugar, but every household had its way of making it just right. Cornbread and beans told a story of endurance and community, of hard hands and full hearts. It wasn't luxury, it was life, steady and sustaining, passed from one generation to the next as a lesson in gratitude and grace. It reminded everyone that love, like good beans, only grows stronger the longer it's tended.
Thickening stews with okra was a technique rooted in West African cooking traditions that Black grandmothers carried across generations. When gumbo or stew needed body without flour or cornstarch, Grandma sliced fresh okra and added it to the simmering pot. As the okra cooked, it released natural mucilage that thickened the liquid into a silky, rich consistency. This wasn't just about texture, but about honoring culinary heritage stretching back centuries across the Atlantic. The okra added its own subtle flavor, earthy and green, complementing seafood, chicken, and sausage beautifully. Grandma knew exactly when to add it and how long to cook it, controlling thickness through timing alone. This ancient technique required just knowledge, passed through generations of cooks. Number 9, frying hoe cakes thin on a flat griddle. Not every cornbread came out of a deep pan, and the flattest one carried the heaviest history. A thin batter of meal, salt, and water was spooned onto a hot greased griddle and fried like a pancake, crisp at the lacy edges and tender in the middle, flipped once and eaten hot off the iron. The name tells you where it began. Enslaved field hands cooked these cakes on the blade of a garden hoe held over the coals, because a hoe was the only flat metal surface they were given out in the fields. That story of cooking supper on a farming tool has carried down through generations as a mark of endurance and plain ingenuity under cruelty. The cakes drew on griddle traditions enslaved Africans carried with them, breads made from ground millet and sorghum back home that adapted easily once cornmeal became the grain most within reach in the American South. A hoe cake needed no oven and no waiting, which made it the perfect bread for people who had neither time nor tools to spare. It cooked in minutes, stretched a fistful of meal into a meal, and tasted of corn and hot grease and nothing else. Heat the griddle, spoon it thin, and flip when the edges go lace. Number 14, render tallow coating. Beef tallow, rendered slowly from suet until clear and golden, was poured over cheese wheels, sausage links, and dried meats to create a waxy seal that blocked air and moisture. The tallow hardened at room temperature into a firm barrier, like a coat of armor that kept food usable for months. A sausage link sealed in tallow could sit on a cellar shelf through an entire winter and come out tasting nearly the same as the day it was made. The seal was so complete that you had to crack it apart with your hands before you could slice the meat inside. Health departments called this outdated once refrigeration became affordable, but tallow coating works on the same principle as vacuum sealing. It creates an oxygen-free environment that prevents oxidation and stops aerobic bacteria from growing. You can still find artisan cheese makers in Vermont using wax coatings for the same reason. The difference is that they charge a premium for it. Your grandmother gave it away. Number 13, fermented hot sauce. Black families in Louisiana and the Carolina Low Country packed fresh peppers into jars with salt and let them sit on the shelf for weeks or months. The peppers bubbled, softened, and transformed into a tangy, complex hot sauce through lacto-fermentation. No vinegar needed, no cooking required. The salt drew water from the peppers and created a brine where lactic acid bacteria thrived, while harmful organisms could not. The longer the sauce sat, the deeper the flavor became. A jar that started sharp and simple in September tasted rounded and complex by Thanksgiving, like wine aging in a barrel. Health codes eventually required commercially sold hot sauces to be heat processed, which killed the beneficial bacteria that made fermented sauce special. But research published in journals on food microbiology has confirmed that lacto-fermented foods contain probiotic strains that support digestive health. The hot sauce on your grandmother's table was alive with beneficial bacteria that a pasteurized bottle from the grocery store does not contain. She was feeding your family's gut microbiome before that phrase existed. Number 13, reviving stale bread over the rising steam of a pot. 3-day-old biscuits in Big Mama's bread box were never thrown to the chickens. They were brought back to life. She would set a colander or a square of cheesecloth over a pot of simmering water on the back of the stove, lay the dry biscuits or rolls in a single layer on top, and cover the whole thing with a clean dish towel for about 5 minutes. The rising steam reached up into the bread. The starch molecules that had retrograded into hardness rehydrated and softened, and the biscuits came off the colander warm and tender as if they had just come out of the oven. The same move worked on a stale loaf of yesterday's white bread, on a corner of pone, on a hard heel of cornbread saved from supper. Nothing went stale enough to throw away in a house where steam was free. The bread came back, the family ate, and the grocery dollar stretched another day past Sunday. Number 14, keeping a kitchen garden producing food 12 months a year. Most people treat a garden as a summer project. Put some tomatoes in, harvest in August, let the plot go dead in October. A Depression era Black grandmother treated that same patch of dirt as a year-round operation that never shut down. Spring was for lettuce, radishes, green onions, and early peas. Summer was the heavy season: tomatoes, pole beans, squash, okra, cucumbers, and hot peppers. But fall was where the real skill showed itself. Turnip greens went into the ground in September and kept producing through the first frost. Collards got planted in October and actually tasted sweeter after cold weather hit them. Winter onions sat in the soil through the frozen months and pushed up green shoots as soon as the ground softened. Grandmothers who understood their climate had something green and edible growing in every single month of the year. The rows were short, sometimes just a narrow strip of earth along the side of the house or a few mounds behind the chicken coop, but the ground never sat empty. Composting happened without the word for it, kitchen scraps tossed directly onto the beds to rot and feed the soil. Seeds were saved from season to season, never purchased. Tools were borrowed and shared between 3 or 4 houses on the same road. The result was a household that barely needed the produce section at any store. When supermarkets started expanding into black neighborhoods in the 1950s, these women already had systems in place that outperformed anything on the shelves. They had been feeding families from dirt and patience for decades before the store arrived and tried to charge them for what they already knew how to grow. Number 20, dirty rice cooked pit-side. Along the Gulf Coast and across Louisiana, a father did not just grill meat, he cooked the rice on the same fire. Dirty rice got its name from the color, dark brown from chicken livers and ground meat cooked down with onion, celery, bell pepper, and cayenne. At a cookout, the pot sat on a grate at the edge of the grill, picking up smoke while the rice absorbed the stock. It served as the foundation of the plate, the thing everything else sat on top of. Every man had his version, and every version tasted different from the last. Dirty rice stopped appearing at cookouts when the men who made it stopped passing the method down. Coast and across Louisiana did not just grill meat. Its name from the color, meat cooked down with onion, bell pepper, and cayenne. At a cookout, the pot sat on a grate at the edge of the grill, picking up smoke while the rice absorbed.